There is a body of water on this planet so hostile that almost nothing can survive contact with it, not because it is polluted, not because it is acidic, because of what it does to living cells the moment they enter it. The water pulls moisture from cells so aggressively that life does not drown in it. It desiccates. It dries out from the inside while still submerged. The mechanism is not unusual chemistry. It is chemistry working exactly as it is supposed to, taken to an extreme that living things were simply never built to survive. And this place has been this way for millions of years, long before a single human being ever stood on its shore. It was already lethal. Every ancient civilization that encountered it reached the same conclusion. Greek, Roman, Hebrew, Arab, Persian. None of them needed a scientific framework to name what they were looking at. They called it dead, not as poetry, not as myth, as a direct observation, one that science would spend centuries trying to fully explain. The Dead Sea is not simply the saltiest lake on Earth. There are other hypersaline lakes that still support ecosystems. What makes this place different is its chemistry, not just how much salt it contains, but what that salt is made of. Its water does not merely stress living cells, it dismantles them, and the reason for that begins not at the surface, but deep beneath it. The Dead Sea sits more than 430 meters below sea level, the lowest exposed point on the surface of the Earth. It rests inside a tectonic rift where two continental plates have been slowly tearing apart for millions of years. The fact that it sits at the bottom of the world is not separate from why nothing can live in it. The two are directly connected. Ancient people believed this place had been cursed, that the land beneath it had been poisoned by catastrophe, that something had happened here to make the earth itself reject life. The geology almost seems to agree. And the strangest part, there is life here. Something does survive in the Dead Sea, but what it is, and what its existence suggests about the water around it, does not make this place feel less strange. It makes it feel stranger. Today, we go back to the beginning of this place and follow it all the way to what is happening to it right now. If you enjoy this kind of content, a like and subscribe helps more people find it. And I'm curious, what brought you here tonight? Can't sleep or just love this kind of thing? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's go back millions of years to the moment the Earth began building this place of death. Long before any human being stood on these shores and searched for language strong enough to describe what they were seeing, the land itself had already begun separating in silence. Deep beneath the deserts of the Middle East, the crust of the earth entered a slow mechanical movement that continues even now, invisible across the span of a human life, yet immense across geological time. To the east, the Arabian plate drifted gradually away. To the west, the African plate moved with equal patience in the opposite direction. Between them, the surface of the planet weakened, stretched, and began to sink. The Dead Sea exists because the Earth tore open here. The fracture is called the Dead Sea Rift, part of a fault system extending from the mountains of southern Turkey through the Jordan Valley and toward the Red Sea below. For approximately 25 million years, the crust in this region has been thinning under tension, descending little by little as the two tectonic plates continue their separation. The movement is almost impossibly slow, only a few millimeters each year, yet over millions of years, the result became enormous. Valleys deepened, rock layers shifted sideways, entire landscapes rearranged themselves. The basin that formed between these plates continued sinking lower and lower until it became the deepest exposed depression on the surface of the Earth. The basin still descends now. The process never ended. Everything that followed began with that single physical fact. Rivers descending from surrounding mountains naturally flowed toward the lowest available elevation. Seasonal streams carried dissolved minerals, eroded from limestone, basalt, and ancient sedimentary rock. Springs emerged from fractured stone along the valley floor. Eventually, the Jordan River entered the basin from the north, carrying fresh water downward through an increasingly arid landscape until it reached the deepest point available. There the water stopped. No river exits the Dead Sea. There is no outlet cutting through the surrounding terrain toward another ocean. No underground channel drains the accumulating water away. The basin is sealed by the shape of the land itself, enclosed within rock and desert. Water can enter freely, but once it arrives, only one path remains open. It must leave through the air. Under the desert heat, evaporation became relentless. Summers here stretch beneath temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, with rainfall so limited that entire years pass in near complete dryness. The sun removes water molecule by molecule from the surface, lifting it invisibly into the atmosphere above the Rift Valley. Yet the dissolved minerals carried into the basin cannot follow. Salt does not evaporate. Magnesium does not evaporate. Calcium, potassium, bromine, sulfur all remain behind after the water disappears into the sky. Then more water arrives. Then more minerals remain. For millions of years, the cycle repeated with extraordinary consistency. Rivers carried dissolved geology into the basin. The desert extracted only the water. Everything else accumulated slowly at the bottom of the world, grain after grain, crystal after crystal, an arithmetic of concentration operating across spans of time, so large that human civilization occupies only the final fraction of a second. The Dead Sea was never a normal lake that later became corrupted. Its condition emerged directly from the architecture of the planet beneath it. The chemistry came from tectonics, the salinity came from isolation, the depth, the density, the hostility of the water, all trace back to the same geological arrangement established millions of years ago when the crust first began opening in this region. Geology built a trap and climate sealed it shut. Every liter of water that entered carried a small mineral memory of the landscape surrounding the basin. None of those minerals escaped. They waited in the descending water year after year as the concentration climbed beyond the thresholds tolerated by ordinary life. What ancient people eventually named dead was not the result of disaster or contamination. It was the natural conclusion of a process the earth had been performing patiently since long before human beings existed to witness it. Across the deserts of Earth, there are other lakes where salt gathers in astonishing quantities beneath hard white sunlight. In northern Utah, the Great Salt Lake stretches across broad, shallow basins, alive with drifting clouds of brine. Shrimp and the tiny movements of brine flies, skimming the shoreline. In Djibouti, Lake Assal rests within volcanic stone under immense heat, its waters carrying salinity levels that approach those of the Dead Sea itself. Even there, along the margins where mineral crusts meet black rock, microbial life persists in thin, invisible films. These places are hostile, ancient, and chemically severe, yet they remain recognizably alive. The Dead Sea crossed a different threshold. Its salinity rests at approximately 34%, nearly 10 times saltier than average ocean water, though the number alone conceals more than it reveals. Ocean water carries its minerals in a composition familiar to life. Approximately 85% of dissolved ocean salts consist of sodium chloride, the same mineral humans scatter across food and preserve fish with along distant coasts. Biological systems on Earth evolved in the presence of sodium chloride for billions of years. Cells learned its behavior slowly through deep evolutionary time. Even organisms that cannot survive in seawater still belong to a planetary history shaped beside it. The Dead Sea speaks a different chemical language. Nearly half of its dissolved mineral content consists of magnesium chloride, and magnesium at these concentrations behaves less like an environmental stress and more like a direct assault against the internal machinery of living cells. The difference is quiet at first glance. Both substances crystallize into pale mineral forms beneath the desert air. Both dissolve invisibly into water. Yet within biology, the distinction becomes enormous. Every living organism depends upon enzymes, microscopic molecular structures folded into delicate shapes that guide the chemistry of life forward, moment by moment. They assemble proteins, release energy, repair damaged tissue, and regulate the endless reactions required to keep a cell alive. Magnesium ions in the concentrations found within the Dead Sea interfere with these structures directly. The surrounding water becomes chemically crowded, overwhelming the fragile balance enzymes require in order to function correctly. Reactions slow, distort, or stop entirely. At the same time, the membranes surrounding cells begin to destabilize. A cell membrane is not merely a wall, it is a living boundary, maintaining separation between the chemistry inside the organism and the chemistry beyond it. In ordinary environments, this boundary remains flexible and controlled, regulating the passage of water, nutrients, and electrical charge. Inside the Dead Sea, that balance begins to collapse. Magnesium chloride weakens the membrane itself, altering its permeability until the distinction between internal and external conditions starts to dissolve. Beneath this, another system fails quietly. Every complex cell on Earth depends upon sodium-potassium pumps embedded within the membrane surface. Tiny molecular engines continuously moving charged particles in and out to maintain electrical stability. Nerves depend upon them, muscles depend upon them, energy production depends upon them. Even the resting state of a living cell depends upon this invisible exchange continuing without interruption. In the chemistry of the Dead Sea, those pumps cannot maintain equilibrium. Electrical gradients vanish. Communication between cells falters. The infrastructure underlying biological organization begins failing all at once. This is why the Dead Sea cannot be explained through salinity alone. Other hypersaline lakes challenge life primarily through dehydration and osmotic stress. The Dead Sea reaches deeper than that. Its chemistry interferes simultaneously with enzymes, membranes, and electrical regulation, attacking several of the oldest and most universal systems in biology together. No single evolutionary adaptation protects against every effect at once. Organisms that survive intense sodium chloride environments elsewhere encounter here a mineral composition unlike anything most life on Earth has ever needed to endure. The lake at the bottom of the rift did not simply become too salty. Over millions of years, it assembled a chemistry so specific, so concentrated, and so biologically unfamiliar that the ordinary strategies life developed across the planet ceased to function within it. Inside every living thing on Earth, from the smallest bacterium drifting unseen through water to the muscle tissue of a fish turning slowly through a river current, there exists a quiet balance maintained every second of its existence. Cells carry water within themselves, the way fruit carries moisture beneath its skin. Their membranes remain thin and selective, allowing certain substances to pass while holding others back. Life depends upon this separation remaining stable. The chemistry inside a cell must remain different from the chemistry outside it, or the structure begins to fail. Water is always trying to restore balance. This movement, called osmosis, is among the oldest and most universal forces in biology. Wherever a membrane separates fluids of different concentrations, water begins drifting toward the side, containing more dissolved material. The process requires no intention and no awareness. It emerges automatically from the behavior of molecules themselves, a silent physical tendency operating continuously inside every organism alive today. In ordinary lakes and rivers, cells manage this exchange carefully. Fish living in freshwater constantly absorb water through their tissues and must expel the excess to survive. Marine fish in the ocean face the opposite challenge, slowly losing moisture to surrounding seawater and compensating by drinking continuously while regulating salts through specialized organs. Across billions of years, life adapted itself to these familiar gradients. The Dead Sea exists beyond those evolutionary negotiations. When a freshwater fish crosses from the Jordan River into the Dead Sea, the concentration outside its body changes almost instantly, from survivable to catastrophic. The surrounding water contains mineral concentrations roughly 10 times greater than the fluids inside the animal's cells. Osmosis responds immediately. Water begins leaving the fish through every exposed membrane, simultaneously drawn outward toward the denser external chemistry with overwhelming force. The fish does not suffocate in the ordinary sense. Its gills still contact water. Oxygen still exists around it. Yet inside the tissues, something far more fundamental begins collapsing. Cells lose water faster than biological systems can replace it. Membranes contract inward, proteins deform, blood chemistry destabilizes, muscular coordination vanishes almost immediately as millions of cells throughout the body undergo the same mechanical dehydration at once. This is osmotic shock. The phrase sounds clinical and distant, though the process itself is brutally direct. Water is extracted from living tissue so rapidly that the organism effectively begins drying from the inside while fully submerged. Death arrives not gradually but mechanically, the consequence of physical laws operating too quickly for adaptation to intervene. A fish entering the Dead Sea may die before completing a single body length through the water. The same process governs nearly everything else that contacts the lake. Bacteria capable of decomposing organic material collapse under the same osmotic pressure. Fungi fail. Insects carried into the water fail. Plant tissue softens, shrinks, and mineralizes rather than decaying normally. Even after death, the decomposer organisms responsible for breaking bodies apart remain unable to survive in the surrounding chemistry. The force that kills also interrupts the ordinary process of decay. Human beings encounter this mechanism differently, though not gently. The outermost layer of skin evolved specifically to reduce water loss and provides temporary resistance against the lake's chemistry. Floating in the water does not immediately destroy tissue, yet any cut, abrasion, or contact with the eyes or mouth produces immediate burning pain as exposed cells begin losing moisture within seconds. The sensation is not symbolic or imagined. It is osmotic extraction made visible through the nervous system. The extraordinary density of the water emerges from the same mineral burden. A liter of fresh water weighs approximately 1 kilogram. A liter of Dead Sea water weighs significantly more, carrying dissolved salts so concentrated that the human body rises involuntarily toward the surface. Swimming becomes strangely awkward. Legs lift without effort. The water supports the body almost too efficiently, holding it upward with unnatural insistence. Ancient people standing beside the river mouth needed no chemistry to understand what they were witnessing. Fish drifting accidentally into the basin died before their eyes with terrifying consistency. Living things entered one body of water and failed in the next. The evidence repeated itself endlessly beneath the desert sun until the conclusion hardened into language itself. The lake was dead because everything living that crossed into it became so with astonishing speed. Sometimes the valley moves without warning. Stone shifts beneath sleeping cities, cliffs loosen in the darkness and descend into riverbeds below. Water changes direction overnight. Along the Dead Sea Fault, the ground itself behaves less like permanence and more like pressure waiting for release, carrying within it the slow, unfinished motion of continents still sliding past one another beneath the surface of the Middle East. The Arabian Plate continues drifting northward relative to the African Plate, though the movement is uneven and restrained by friction deep underground. Rock masses lock together for decades or centuries, while tectonic stress accumulates silently beneath them. Eventually, the pressure exceeds what the stone can withstand. The fault ruptures. Energy stored across enormous spans of crust releases in seconds, and the valley convulses. Ancient communities living beside the Dead Sea did not inhabit a passive landscape. They lived within an active fracture in the earth. In the year 749, one of the most destructive earthquakes in the recorded history of the region tore through the Jordan Valley and surrounding cities. Modern estimates place the event above magnitude 7. Entire urban centers collapsed almost simultaneously. Tiberias suffered catastrophic destruction. Beit Shean fell into ruin. Hippos overlooking the Sea of Galilee fractured apart. Jerash lost temples, streets, and colonnades beneath cascading stone. Tens of thousands of people across the Levant died within moments as masonry roofs and walls failed around them. Archaeological layers still preserve the violence of that morning. Tilted columns remain where the ground shifted beneath them. Streets cracked open, buildings collapsed sideways in the direction of seismic movement. Beneath later settlements, the evidence remains frozen in dust and shattered limestone, a geological sentence written suddenly across entire cities at once. The valley has repeated this behavior many times. In the year 1927, another earthquake struck near Jericho. Though smaller than the catastrophe of 749, it still altered the Jordan River itself. Landslides collapsed from unstable slopes into the channel, temporarily damming sections of the river and interrupting its flow. Historical descriptions from far older texts preserve strikingly similar events. Accounts once interpreted only through theology also describe moments when the Jordan ceased flowing after sudden collapses along its banks. The fault beneath the valley had been performing this behavior long before anyone understood tectonics. Across millions of years, the total horizontal displacement between the plates has reached approximately 105 kilometers. Entire geological formations that once aligned continuously now sit separated by enormous distances. Rivers shifted course, ancient lakes vanished, valleys deepened. The modern Dead Sea Basin emerged from this accumulated motion slowly enough that no generation could witness the full transformation, yet relentlessly enough that the region never truly settled into stability. Even places of refuge here owe their existence to fracture. Along the western shoreline, at Ein Gedi, fresh water emerges from the cliffs through springs heated gently by geothermal activity below. Pressure and heat move upward through cracks in the rock, carrying water from hidden aquifers toward the desert surface. Palm trees and vegetation gather around these springs in striking contrast to the mineral silence surrounding them. Human beings have lived continuously at Ein Gedi for approximately 6,000 years, sustained by water rising through the same tectonic system responsible for the region's earthquakes. The fault gives and destroys in the same motion. Sulfur deposits appear naturally throughout the surrounding terrain, yellow mineral traces exposed along fractured stone and sediment layers. Ancient people knew the substance as brimstone. In sunlight, the deposits glimmer faintly against the pale desert rock, carrying a sharp mineral scent when disturbed. Combined with occasional geothermal vapors, the asphalt seeps rising from deeper formations, and the recurring earthquakes that opened fissures through the valley floor, the landscape often appeared less like ordinary geography and more like something wounded beneath the surface. To stand here in antiquity was to encounter a world behaving outside familiar expectations. Water killed what entered it. The earth trembled unpredictably beneath settlements. Hot springs emerged from barren cliffs. Sulfurous minerals surfaced from underground. Entire cities vanished during moments of violent shaking, preserved in living memory for generations afterward. The conclusion many ancient cultures reached was not irrational. They were observing genuine geological instability without the language modern science would eventually provide. Beneath every story of curses, punishment, and divine destruction stood a physical landscape that truly moved, fractured, and reshaped itself beneath human feet. Far beneath the modern lakebed, under layers of crystallized salt and compacted sediment, there are traces of another sea entirely. When researchers lower drilling equipment through the floor of the basin and extract narrow cylinders of buried earth, the cores emerge striped with ancient histories. Fine bands of clay alternate with mineral deposits. Microscopic shells appear from vanished marine organisms. Embedded within the stone are chemical signatures belonging not to the Dead Sea, but to the distant Mediterranean, preserved from an age when this basin was still intermittently connected to open ocean water. The Dead Sea has not always been the Dead Sea. The tectonic depression itself began forming approximately 25 million years ago as the rift system deepened between the separating plates. Yet, the lethal hypersaline lake known today is far younger. For immense stretches of geological time, the basin shifted through different identities depending upon climate, rainfall, and the changing relationship between surrounding waterways and the sea beyond the Levant. There were periods when marine water entered the valley from the north through temporary connections to the Mediterranean basin. These incursions flooded the depression with seawater before retreating again as tectonic uplift and shifting terrain closed the pathways. Each invasion left behind sediments rich with marine minerals and microscopic life forms that settled quietly to the bottom and hardened over millions of years into geological memory. Later, the basin transformed again. During colder and wetter climatic periods, long before cities rose around the Jordan Valley, rainfall across the Middle East increased dramatically. Rivers expanded. Seasonal floods became more persistent. The basin filled higher and wider than it appears today, creating an enormous freshwater and low salinity lake known now as Lake Lasan. At its greatest extent, during the last glacial maximum approximately 26,000 years ago, the lake's surface stood nearly 200 meters above the modern shoreline and stretched across much of the Jordan Valley in a continuous body of water. Lake Lasan was not lifeless. The chemistry remained far less concentrated than the present basin. Fish likely moved through its waters. Aquatic plants occupied the shallows. Bird migration routes followed its margins through changing seasons. Along the shorelines, early humans established camps beside a lake entirely different from the one later generations would inherit. Archaeological discoveries, scattered along ancient terraces, reveal stone tools, hearth remains, and evidence of repeated human occupation dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Homo sapiens, and possibly earlier hominids before them, hunted and traveled beside water that still belonged to the ordinary biological world. Then the climate shifted once more. As the last ice age loosened its hold upon the planet, rainfall across the Middle East gradually declined. Temperatures rose, rivers weakened. Lake Lizan began retreating deeper into the basin left waiting beneath it. Shorelines contracted century after century as evaporation increasingly exceeded inflow. Minerals accumulated in greater concentrations. The chemistry tightened slowly toward extremity. No single generation would have witnessed the full transformation. The process unfolded across thousands of years, gradual enough to resemble permanence within a human lifetime, yet relentless, across the scale of civilization. A fisherman, standing on the shore during one century, might still recognize the lake inherited by his grandchildren. Yet over deep stretches of memory, the water was becoming less habitable, less forgiving, more chemically severe. The white-layered cliffs, visible throughout the Jordan Valley, today preserve this retreat in physical form. These deposits, known as the Listen Formation, consist of ancient sediments left exposed as the lake withdrew downward into the modern basin. Their pale bands rise along the valley walls like water lines abandoned by time itself, marking elevations where living water once rested far above the present shore. By the beginning of recorded history, the transformation was effectively complete. The shrinking lake had crossed the threshold into permanent hypersalinity, becoming the chemically hostile basin later civilizations encountered and named. Yet hidden within the geology remains the memory of another landscape entirely, one where freshwater ecosystems existed in a valley now associated almost exclusively with mineral silence. The Dead Sea, therefore, possesses not only an origin, but a biography. It began as a tectonic wound, opening slowly through the crust. It spent millions of years shifting between marine and inland identities. It expanded during colder ages into a vast living lake. Then, under increasing desert aridity, it contracted inward until the chemistry hardened into the condition that ancient observers would eventually recognize as death. Long before chemistry could measure salinity or geology could map tectonic faults, human beings stood beside this water and began recording what they saw. The observations survive, scattered across thousands of years in scrolls, histories, travel accounts, and religious texts written by people separated by language, empire, and belief. Yet beneath their differences, the descriptions settle repeatedly into the same physical details, as though the lake itself allowed only one honest account of its nature. The oldest surviving references emerge from the Hebrew Bible, assembled gradually between approximately the 10th and 6th centuries before the Common Era. These texts describe the Valley of Sodom as a landscape marked by bitumen pits and transformed terrain, a region remembered not for fertile abundance, but for rupture and desolation. The water appears not as ordinary lake water, but as something altered, a body existing outside familiar expectations. Even in these earliest written traditions, the surrounding geography already carried the atmosphere of aftermath, as though the land had endured some immense transition before the arrival of recorded memory. Centuries later, the Greek geographer Strabo traveled through the eastern Mediterranean world, gathering observations into what would become one of antiquity's great geographical works. Writing during the 1st century before the Common Era, he described a lake where fish could not survive, where black asphalt rose from the depths, and where human bodies floated with unusual ease upon the surface. He wrote carefully, almost clinically, recording physical properties rather than mythology. Modern analysis has confirmed each observation with remarkable precision. The buoyancy, the mineral concentration, the absence of aquatic life all remain measurable realities today. The Greeks themselves did not primarily call it the Dead Sea. To them, it was Lake Asphaltites, the asphalt lake, named for the dark bitumen masses periodically surfacing from beneath the water. Those floating deposits carried practical value throughout the ancient world, used in waterproofing, construction, and embalming. What struck Greek observers most strongly was not death itself, but the strange black substance emerging from the basin in heavy mineral sheets. Other cultures named the lake differently because they noticed different aspects of the same anomaly. In the 1st century of the Common Era, the Jewish historian Josephus wrote of the lake with the detail of someone who had likely seen it directly. He described its buoyancy, its inability to sustain animal life, and the organized collection of asphalt from the water's surface. His writing lacks exaggeration. Instead, it carries the steady tone of observation, repeated enough times to become ordinary to those living nearby. Around the same period, Pliny the Elder included the lake in his vast natural history. He stated plainly that neither fish nor water birds lived there, and that objects thrown into the water resisted submersion. The account survives now not as folklore, but as accurate physical reporting from nearly 2,000 years ago. The chemistry had not changed. The water behaved then exactly as it behaves now. By the 10th century, the Arab geographer al-Muqaddasi described the same shoreline through another language and another civilization. Salt crystals gathered along the banks. The water felt unusually heavy. Aquatic life remained absent. More than a millennium separated his account from Strabo's, yet the descriptions align almost perfectly. Independent observers encountering the same physical reality beneath different empires and faiths. Medieval pilgrims arriving en route toward Jerusalem often interpreted the landscape through theology, though beneath the religious language, their writings preserve valuable environmental detail. They noted retreating shorelines, mineral deposits, barren margins, and strange atmospheric conditions. Modern researchers studying historical water levels have used some of these records to reconstruct changes in the basin across centuries. The English name Dead Sea descends from the Latin mare mortuum, itself translating the older Hebrew phrase Yam Hamavet, the Sea of Death. The wording endured because the observations endured. Across 3,000 years, through Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and Persian traditions, independent witnesses continued arriving at essentially the same conclusion. Not because they copied one another, but because the lake continued presenting the same evidence to every civilization that stood upon its shore. At irregular moments across antiquity, the surface of the lake would darken with something rising slowly from below. Great masses of black material detached from the basin floor and drifted upward through the dense mineral water until they broke the surface in silence, heavy and glistening beneath the desert sun. Ancient writers compared some of them to boats in size. Others described fragments torn apart by waves and gathered along the shoreline in sticky mineral heaps, carrying the sharp scent of sulfur. This substance helped define the Dead Sea for thousands of years. Deep beneath the basin lies a geological formation rich in bitumen, a naturally occurring form of asphalt created through the slow transformation of buried organic material under pressure and heat. The tectonic instability beneath the rift fractured the surrounding rock over immense spans of time, opening pathways through which bitumen gradually migrated upward. Geothermal forces beneath the valley continued pushing gases and heated fluids through these cracks, carrying asphalt toward the lakebed above. Eventually, pressure loosened sections large enough to break free. The Dead Sea's unusual density allowed these bitumen masses to rise and float once released, black against the pale mineral water. Ancient people witnessing this phenomenon saw the earth itself producing a substance unlike ordinary mud or stone. It emerged from below without warning, carrying the smell of burning minerals and decay, surfacing from water already associated with death. To Greek observers, this became the defining characteristic of the lake itself. They called it Lake Asphaltites because the asphalt mattered practically, economically, and visually more than anything else they encountered there. The material traveled far beyond the Jordan Valley. Ancient Egypt imported Dead Sea bitumen in substantial quantities for embalming and preservation rituals. Modern chemical analysis has confirmed the connection with remarkable precision. Researchers studying mummified remains, more than 3,000 years old, identified molecular compounds known as triterpenes within the embalming mixtures. These compounds match the chemical profile of Dead Sea asphalt deposits exactly, creating a geological fingerprint linking Egyptian funerary practices directly to the mineral basin far to the northeast. Long before formal empires controlled stable trade networks, asphalt from the Dead Sea was already moving between civilizations. Caravans carried it southward through desert routes older than many written languages. The substance waterproofed boats navigating the Nile. Builders mixed it into mortar for construction projects exposed to moisture. Physicians incorporated it into medicinal compounds believed to possess restorative properties. Craftsmen used it as an adhesive and binding material in a world where naturally occurring industrial substances remained rare and valuable. The lake that destroyed organic life also sustained economies. For centuries, the Nabateans controlled much of this trade. Their civilization flourished across the desert routes linking Arabia, the Levant, and Egypt, eventually carving the city of Petra directly into rose-colored sandstone cliffs. The wealth supporting parts of that network flowed partly from the strange black substance rising from the Dead Sea. Traders monitored the shoreline carefully after seismic disturbances, waiting for new asphalt masses to surface where they could be harvested, divided, and transported across the ancient world. Even the smell surrounding the basin belonged partly to this hidden geology. The same formations producing bitumen also released hydrogen sulfide gas through fractures beneath the valley. Ancient visitors consistently recorded sulfurous odors hanging over parts of the shoreline, especially near regions where geothermal activity disturbed the water below. Combined with drifting asphalt, mineral crusts, seismic instability, and the lake's lethal chemistry, the atmosphere surrounding the basin often resembled something emerging from beneath the earth rather than resting peacefully upon it. For people living without geology or chemistry, the interpretation required no exaggeration. They encountered a place where black material surfaced from invisible depths, where the air carried traces of sulfur, where water killed living things and preserved the dead, where the ground itself shifted unpredictably through generations. Associations with the underworld, divine punishment, or wounded earth emerged naturally from direct sensory experience. The asphalt did not merely float upon the Dead Sea. It revealed something deeper beneath it, a reminder that the strange chemistry of the basin belonged to a much larger geological system, still moving invisibly below the desert floor. Among the oldest stories attached to the Dead Sea is the memory of cities destroyed so completely that later generations struggled to separate history from warning. The names Sodom and Gomorrah entered human language not merely as places but as symbols of sudden catastrophe, landscapes erased beneath fire and mineral ruin. For centuries, the account remained suspended between theology and legend, preserved in sacred texts, yet impossible to verify through ordinary historical methods. Beneath the desert east of the Dead Sea, however, archaeologists eventually began uncovering evidence that something extraordinary truly happened in this valley long ago. The biblical narrative describes the plain of Jordan before destruction as fertile and heavily inhabited, watered sufficiently to resemble a garden in the middle of an otherwise harsh landscape. This memory matters because it contrasts sharply with the mineral basin later encountered by surrounding civilizations. The story does not begin with desolation. It begins with abundance transformed into absence. At the archaeological site of Tal el-Hammam in modern Jordan, researchers excavated the remains of a substantial Bronze Age city occupied for centuries before its sudden destruction, around 1650 years before the Common Era. The settlement once contained defensive walls, administrative buildings, storage complexes, and evidence of organized urban life spread across a large area overlooking the Jordan Valley. Then something interrupted that continuity violently. Within the destruction layer, archaeologists discovered material altered by temperatures far beyond those produced by ordinary ancient fires. Pottery surfaces had melted and hardened again into glass-like textures. Mud brick structures, partially vitrified under intense heat. Embedded throughout the debris were microscopic spherules containing shocked minerals, including traces of platinum, iridium, and tiny diamonds formed under immense pressure. These signatures resemble the effects observed at known high-energy impact sites, rather than the aftermath of warfare or accidental fire. Temperature estimates from the damaged material exceed approximately 2,000 degrees Celsius. No Bronze Age technology could generate such heat intentionally. There are no volcanoes in the region capable of explaining it. Conventional urban destruction leaves very different archaeological traces. In 2021, a large interdisciplinary research team published a peer-reviewed paper proposing that the evidence matched the effects of a low-altitude cosmic airburst, an atmospheric explosion caused by a celestial object disintegrating before impact. The comparison most frequently invoked was the Tunguska event that occurred above Siberia in 1908, where an incoming object exploded in the atmosphere with enough force to flatten forests across thousands of square kilometers without leaving a crater behind. Such an event above the Jordan Valley could have generated temperatures and pressures sufficient to produce the unusual materials found at Tal el-Hammam while devastating settlements across a wide surrounding area. The theory remains debated among researchers, though the physical evidence itself remains difficult to dismiss. Something subjected this landscape to extraordinary heat and force. The region surrounding the Dead Sea already carried geological conditions that reinforced these memories across generations. Sulfur deposits appear naturally throughout the valley and nearby cliffs, exposed visibly within the terrain itself. Ancient observers encountering yellow mineral formations, bitumen seeps, toxic water, and unstable ground required no symbolic imagination to associate the region with fire and destruction emerging from below the earth. At the same time, the environmental transformation of the valley unfolded slowly around these stories. The freshwater systems that once supported larger populations diminished over thousands of years as the basin concentrated toward hypersalinity. Shorelines retreated, fertile margins contracted. Oral traditions, preserving memory of an older and more habitable landscape, would eventually coexist beside the chemically hostile environment inherited by later civilizations. The Dead Sea, therefore, accumulated layers of evidence reinforcing its reputation as a place marked by catastrophe. Cities lay abandoned or shattered near its shores. The water itself rejected ordinary life. Earthquakes fractured the valley unpredictably. Sulfurous minerals emerged naturally from the ground. Ancient memories described fertile plains where mineral desolation later stood. When early cultures shaped theological explanations around this landscape, they were not inventing strangeness from nothing. They were recording a region where geological instability, environmental change, and perhaps even catastrophic events had left visible marks upon the land itself for thousands of years afterward. There are moments in the history of the Dead Sea when the water changes color. Along certain stretches of shoreline, the familiar mineral blue fades into deep crimson or cloudy pink, spreading outward across the basin in irregular patches, visible even from distant cliffs. Ancient travelers recorded the phenomenon with alarm. Medieval pilgrims described lakeside waters, stained red beneath desert light. In modern times, satellites passing silently overhead have photographed the same transformation from orbit, broad swirls of color appearing against the pale mineral landscape below. For most of human history, no explanation existed. A lake already associated with death, sulfur, collapse, and ruined cities now occasionally resembled diluted blood spread across its surface. The interpretation offered itself naturally to every culture that encountered it. Religious writers saw confirmation of divine punishment. Pilgrims approaching Jerusalem carried stories home, describing cursed water changing color without warning. Across centuries, the event reinforced the belief that the valley remained under some continuing sentence imposed long ago. The scientific explanation emerged only gradually during the 20th century, and it proved stranger than the old interpretations in a quieter, more biological way. The color does not come from minerals or pollution. It comes from life. Under ordinary conditions, the salinity of the Dead Sea remains so extreme that only a handful of microscopic organisms can persist within it. Yet, during unusually heavy rainfall, especially after winters that deliver rare surges of fresh water runoff into the basin, the chemistry of the surface layer changes temporarily. For a short period, the uppermost water becomes diluted enough for specialized halophilic microorganisms, organisms adapted specifically to high-salt environments, to reproduce rapidly before the lake returns to its normal chemical severity. Among the most important of these organisms is Dunaliella salina, a single-celled alga capable of surviving in conditions fatal to almost everything else. When exposed to intense sunlight and fluctuating salinity, the organism begins producing extraordinary quantities of beta-carotene, the same pigment responsible for the orange color of carrots and autumn leaves. In concentrated blooms, the pigment spreads visibly through the water itself, tinting sections of the lake red, pink, or rust-colored depending upon light and density. Another contributor belongs to an even older branch of life. Species of Halobacterium inhabit the Dead Sea during these brief ecological windows, members of the Archaea domain whose evolutionary lineage reaches back toward the earliest periods of life on Earth. Within their membranes exists a pigment called bacteriorhodopsin, a light harvesting protein that allows the organisms to capture energy directly from sunlight. The pigment glows red and violet under dense concentrations, deepening the unusual coloration spreading through the water. These blooms remain temporary because the environment itself eventually destroys them. As evaporation intensifies and freshwater input declines, the salinity rises again beyond even the tolerance limits of many halophiles. The microorganisms die back or retreat into isolated survival niches invisible to the human eye. The color fades. The lake resumes its familiar mineral stillness. Yet, during the bloom, the transformation can become immense in scale. Entire sections of shoreline shift visibly in coloration. Modern satellite imagery has tracked blooms extending across many square kilometers, following seasonal rainfall patterns through the desert valleys surrounding the basin. The appearances are not random. They emerge from precise interactions between climate, salinity, sunlight, and microbial adaptation. Ancient observers who interpreted the phenomenon as unnatural were responding to something genuinely extraordinary. Without microbiology or cellular biology, they encountered a body of water long associated with death, suddenly turning the color of blood beneath changing skies. The event violated ordinary expectations in ways few landscapes ever did. What they could not have known was that the redness came from hidden forms of life surviving at the outer edge of biological possibility. The same basin that destroyed fish and resisted ordinary organisms still concealed microscopic descendants of ancient evolutionary lineages, waiting for rare intervals when the chemistry softened just enough to permit a brief eruption of color across the surface. The lake did not merely appear cursed to the people who lived beside it. It behaved unlike any other body of water they had ever known, and sometimes, under the right conditions, it visibly transformed before their eyes into something even stranger. Along the southwestern edge of the basin, where the desert rises in pale, fractured ridges above the mineral shoreline, there stands a mountain made not primarily of stone, but of salt. Mount Sodom rises approximately 200 meters above the surrounding terrain, its cliffs streaked white beneath the desert light, its surface constantly reshaped by heat, erosion, and the slow chemical restlessness of the basin around it. From a distance, it appears almost unfinished, as though the landscape itself crystallized upward from the lake and hardened before fully becoming rock. The mountain exists because the Dead Sea never stopped accumulating minerals. For millions of years, dissolved salts settled into the basin floor layer by layer as evaporation removed water and left everything else behind. Buried beneath younger sediments, enormous underground deposits of halite gradually formed under pressure. Yet salt behaves differently from ordinary rock. It is lighter and more flexible, deep underground, capable of moving slowly through surrounding geological layers when compressed over immense spans of time. This process is known as salt diaparism. Beneath Mount Sodom, the buried salt deposit began rising upward through the overlying earth like thick mineral wax forced slowly toward the surface. Over approximately 10,000 years, the pressure beneath the basin pushed the halite higher and higher, deforming the landscape above it until an entire mountain emerged from accumulated evaporated minerals. The same geological history responsible for the Dead Sea's chemistry also built this formation directly from the remains of ancient water. The mountain continues rising even now at a measurable rate. It is not a fossil from a completed process, but part of an active system still responding to tectonic pressure beneath the valley. The rift continues shifting, sediments continue compressing, salt continues moving upward through the crust with extraordinary patience. Mount Sodom and the Dead Sea are not separate phenomena. They are different expressions of the same geological mechanism unfolding across millions of years. Its name binds the mountain inseparably to the oldest catastrophe traditions surrounding the basin. The region near Mount Sodom contains several of the most credible archaeological candidates for the ancient plain cities described in biblical accounts. Whether or not those identifications prove definitive, the geography itself fused memory and landscape together across centuries. A mountain of salt, rising beside a chemically lethal lake, naturally attached itself to stories of destruction and transformation already circulating through the ancient world. Inside the mountain, the salt continues changing form. Rare desert rainfall dissolves channels through the halite, carving cave systems directly into the mineral interior. Unlike limestone caves requiring millions of years to develop, salt caves evolve rapidly because halite dissolves far more easily in water. Passageways open and collapse within centuries. Crystalline walls shimmer faintly where light enters through fractures above. Salt stalactites descend from cave ceilings in translucent formations. Salt stalagmites rise slowly from the cave floor beneath them, built from evaporating mineral droplets carrying dissolved crystals through the darkness. Within Mount Sodom lies Malum Cave, officially recognized in recent years as the longest known salt cave system on Earth, extending approximately 10 kilometers through the mountain interior. Survey teams navigating its passages described corridors lined entirely with crystalline sodium chloride, chambers reshaped continuously by each rare flood entering the desert basin from above. The cave does not remain stable for geological eternity. Sections dissolve, reform, and collapse with unusual speed compared to ordinary cave systems. The biblical image of Lot's wife, transformed into a pillar of salt, emerges from visual realities present throughout the shoreline itself. Salt deposits crystallize around rocks, branches, and standing formations exposed near retreating waterlines, gradually creating shapes that resemble human silhouettes beneath the desert sun. Along portions of the coast, these mineral figures stand motionless against the pale cliffs, ordinary geology producing forms that ancient observers folded naturally into narrative memory. Mount Sodom is the Dead Sea made architectural. The dissolved minerals carried into the basin across incomprehensible spans of time did not remain hidden beneath the water forever. Pressure forced them upward into visible form, creating a mountain built from the residue of evaporation itself. Standing beside the lake, the mountain reveals physically what the chemistry has always implied, that the processes shaping this landscape are not temporary disturbances, but accumulations measured across immense geological ages. From the shoreline, the Dead Sea appears unified, a single, uninterrupted surface of mineral water stretching between desert cliffs. Yet beneath that stillness, the lake separates into two distinct worlds, layered one above the other, divided by a narrow chemical boundary hidden roughly 40 meters below the surface. The upper water and the lower water do not truly belong to the same environment. They differ in chemistry, density, oxygen content, and age, held apart by the immense concentration of dissolved minerals accumulated within the basin over thousands of years. Most human beings encounter only the upper layer. This surface water mixes slowly with the atmosphere above it. Winds disturb it gently. Limited oxygen dissolves downward from the air. Seasonal temperature changes affect its chemistry. The familiar turquoise color observed from the shore belongs to this upper region, the layer where floating bodies drift and sunlight still penetrates through the dense mineral water. Then the chemistry changes abruptly. At the halocline, the invisible boundary separating the layers, density increases sharply enough that vertical mixing becomes extremely limited. Below this depth, the water grows heavier, darker, and completely anoxic. Oxygen disappears entirely. The deeper basin remains sealed beneath its own mineral weight, isolated from atmospheric exchange for extraordinary lengths of time. The lower water maintains a nearly constant temperature of approximately 22 degrees Celsius, regardless of season above it. Summer heat and winter cooling lose their influence here. Radiocarbon analysis suggests portions of this deep water have remained isolated for several thousand years and possibly far longer, making it among the oldest static surface water environments on Earth. In practical terms, the lower Dead Sea behaves less like an ordinary lake and more like a preserved chemical reservoir hidden beneath the visible basin. Minerals continue settling downward through the upper layer year after year. The deeper water, therefore, contains even greater concentrations of dissolved salts than the surface above it, a compressed chemical archive recording centuries of accumulation. Every river inflow, every dissolved rock particle carried into the basin, every cycle of evaporation contributed incrementally to the density below the halocline. The separation remained stable for immense spans of time until unusual climatic conditions disrupted it during the 1970s. A period of warming altered the density relationship between the upper and lower waters enough to weaken the halocline temporarily. For the first time in centuries, perhaps millennia, the layers mixed significantly. The result was not gentle blending but visible chemical reaction. Minerals dissolved separately within the two environments suddenly encountered incompatible conditions and precipitated rapidly from the water itself. Portions of the lake turned cloudy white as crystallized deposits formed in suspension throughout the basin. The event revealed how profoundly different the two layers had become while isolated from one another. Even more unusual discoveries waited below. Using underwater robotics and submersible imaging systems, researchers eventually identified freshwater springs emerging directly from the Dead Sea floor beneath the deep anoxic layer. These springs release groundwater upward through fractures in the basin, carrying oxygen and dissolved nutrients into surrounding mineral water dense enough to suppress almost all ordinary biology. Around the spring outlets, microbial communities survive within narrow zones of chemical turbulence where fresh water and hypersaline water collide. These ecosystems exist at boundaries so precise that shifting only a short distance in any direction alters the chemistry beyond survivable limits. Invisible from the surface, life persists beneath the Dead Sea, within tiny pockets created by water rising from hidden aquifers below the desert. The springs also reveal something unexpected about the basin itself. The Dead Sea is not entirely isolated from the surrounding landscape beneath the surface. Groundwater continues circulating invisibly through buried rock systems, feeding the basin from below even as evaporation removes water above. Beneath the apparent stillness operates a concealed hydraulic network, connecting the lake to distant underground reservoirs throughout the valley. The halocline therefore represents more than a physical boundary between layers. It is the visible expression of geological time preserved directly within water itself. Above it drifts the relatively recent surface, exposed to changing seasons and atmosphere. Beneath it rests an older chemical world, sealed away through centuries of mineral accumulation, holding within its density the long, uninterrupted memory of a basin with nowhere for its dissolved history to escape. Long before archaeologists understood what had been hidden in the cliffs above the Dead Sea, the caves themselves waited in almost complete silence, cut into pale limestone overlooking one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Dry desert wind moved through the ravines. Salt drifted invisibly through the air. Below the cliffs, the mineral water remained heavy and still, while above it narrow openings in the rock preserved darkness untouched for centuries. In the summer of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy named Mohammed Dib climbed among those caves, searching for a missing goat, and threw a stone into one of the openings. Instead of striking earth, the stone shattered pottery. Inside stood tall clay jars, sealed for nearly 2,000 years. What emerged from the caves of Qumran would eventually become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, approximately 900 manuscripts preserved in conditions so unusually stable that fragments of parchment, ink, and linen survived from the final centuries before the Common Era into the modern age. Historians would later describe the discovery as one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century, not only because of the texts themselves, but because the environment surrounding the Dead Sea had performed an act of preservation almost impossible elsewhere in the ancient world. The same regional chemistry that destroys ordinary biological processes also suppresses decay. The Dead Sea Basin sits at the lowest exposed elevation on Earth, locked within an arid climate where rainfall remains minimal and evaporation dominates nearly every surface. Organic material introduced into humid environments is usually consumed quickly by bacteria, fungi, insects, and microbial decomposers that recycle dead tissue back into surrounding ecosystems. Near the Dead Sea, many of those decomposer systems operate poorly or not at all. Extreme dryness extracts moisture from exposed material before ordinary decay can fully establish itself. The caves above Qumran became natural preservation chambers. Linen wrappings survived, leather bindings endured, ink remained visible on parchment long after comparable manuscripts elsewhere had dissolved into dust. The killing environment below the cliffs created a preserving environment above them. The same osmotic hostility that destroys living cells in water also limits the microscopic life responsible for decomposition after death. In this landscape, absence itself became protective. Among the manuscripts was the Great Isaiah Scroll, a continuous Hebrew text extending more than 7 meters in length and dating to approximately 125 before the Common Era. Before its discovery, the oldest, nearly complete Hebrew copies of Isaiah available to scholars were separated from the original composition by roughly 1,000 additional years. Suddenly, the textual history of the Hebrew Bible stretched far deeper into antiquity than previously confirmed. Other scrolls preserved community rules, hymns, apocalyptic writings, calendars, biblical commentaries, and records of ritual practice from a Jewish sect widely associated with the Essenes, a group believed to have deliberately withdrawn into the wilderness surrounding the Dead Sea. Their choice of refuge was not accidental. Few landscapes in the ancient Near East felt more removed from ordinary civilization. The cliffs, the mineral air, the silence, and the hostile water below formed a natural boundary between this isolated community and the wider world. One manuscript differed from all the others. The copper scroll was engraved not on parchment, but onto thin sheets of hammered copper, later cut apart by conservators so the oxidized metal could be opened and read. The text described more than 60 hidden caches of gold, silver, and sacred objects buried across the region. No confirmed treasure matching the descriptions has ever been recovered, and portions of the text remain difficult to interpret even now. Modern science eventually returned to the scrolls with tools unimaginable to the people who hid them. Genetic analysis of the parchment identified the animal species from whose hides the manuscripts were produced. Molecular traces preserved within the material allowed researchers to reconstruct trade networks, scribal practices, and the origins of individual fragments. Ancient chemistry preserved biological evidence so thoroughly that laboratories 2 millennia later could still read it. The irony settled quietly into the landscape itself. A place named for death across languages and centuries became one of the greatest archives of survival in human history. The mineral hostility that erased ordinary life from the water below guarded fragile human words in the caves above, holding them motionless through empires, wars, migrations, and centuries of desert wind until the stone struck pottery and the silence finally opened. Before the water itself comes into contact with the body, the Dead Sea announces its presence through the air. The descent into the basin changes the atmosphere gradually, almost invisibly, as the surrounding cliffs rise higher and the floor of the rift sinks deeper beneath global sea level. By the time a person reaches the shoreline, they stand approximately 430 meters below the level of the world's oceans, beneath a thicker column of atmosphere than almost anywhere else accessible on Earth. The difference is measurable. Atmospheric pressure near the Dead Sea averages approximately 1,060 millibars, noticeably higher than the pressure found at ordinary sea level. Oxygen molecules exist here in slightly greater concentration simply because more air rests above the basin. Breathing feels subtly altered, not dramatically easier, but fuller, heavier, carrying a faint density difficult to describe without standing inside it directly. Ancient travelers who described the air as unusual were recording a genuine physical condition with no scientific language available to explain it. Light changes here as well. The additional atmosphere filters ultraviolet radiation more efficiently before sunlight reaches the basin floor. Certain wavelengths arrive weakened after passing through the expanded depth of air above the rift. Combined with the region's mineral haze, the result is an environment where prolonged sunlight exposure affects the skin differently than in surrounding deserts. Roman physicians observed that time spent near the Dead Sea improved some chronic skin conditions, and by the Byzantine period, therapeutic facilities already operated along portions of the shoreline. Modern dermatological studies later confirmed measurable benefits for conditions such as psoriasis when exposure occurred in controlled durations beneath this filtered atmosphere. The air itself carries traces of the lake. As mineral water evaporates continuously beneath desert heat, microscopic particles rise into the atmosphere above the basin. Bromide aerosols exist here in concentrations significantly higher than at ordinary surface elevations. Bromide compounds have long been associated with mild sedative effects and were used medically in the 19th century before safer pharmaceuticals replaced them. Near the Dead Sea, the atmosphere contains those minerals naturally, suspended invisibly within the air moving across the basin. A faint haze often settles above the shoreline, especially during still mornings when heat remains trapped between the valley walls. The haze appears almost milky from a distance, softening outlines and slightly muting the surrounding desert cliffs. Ancient observers repeatedly described the atmosphere as heavy, mineral, or dreamlike. They were not inventing poetic exaggeration. The enclosed geography of the Rift Valley traps evaporated minerals and dense air together within the basin, creating a visible alteration in the atmosphere itself. The paradox deepens beside the water. Direct contact with the lake burns, cuts, dries, exposed tissue, and punishes ordinary biological systems with extraordinary efficiency. Yet the surrounding environment has also drawn human beings seeking relief for thousands of years. Historical accounts suggest Herod the Great visited the region for treatment of chronic illness. Roman bathing complexes and Byzantine therapeutic settlements developed along the shores, sustained by the belief that the Dead Sea possessed unusual restorative properties. That belief survived because measurable effects genuinely existed. The same geological trap that concentrated lethal minerals inside the water also shaped the atmosphere above it. The sealed tectonic basin deepened gradually over millions of years, drawing the landscape lower while heat and evaporation intensified. Minerals accumulated not only within the lake, but within the air, circulating above it. The driest atmosphere, the thickest breathable air, The filtered sunlight and the suspended bromides all emerged from the same geological architecture that created the hypersaline water below. Nothing here exists separately. The water and the air belong to one system, produced by the same descending basin and the same relentless evaporation operating across immense spans of time. Ancient people who entered the water and felt pain while simultaneously finding relief from certain ailments during extended stays near the shore were observing an authentic contradiction built directly into the physics of the place. The Dead Sea was never merely a lake. It became an entire atmospheric environment, a basin where geology altered not only the chemistry of water, but the composition of the air itself. Beneath the weight of the lowered sky, surrounded by mineral haze and silence, human beings encountered a landscape capable of harming and healing through the same invisible processes, a place where the atmosphere carried the memory of the water below it in every breath. The first sensation is resistance. A hand lowered into the Dead Sea does not move through the water with the familiar softness expected from an ordinary lake. The surface pushes back immediately, thicker and heavier, almost oily in the way it supports weight. When a human body enters fully, the physics reveal themselves within seconds. Legs rise toward the surface without effort. The torso lifts upward. The body loses the ability to settle naturally into the water because the water itself is denser than the person floating inside it. An average human body has a density only slightly greater than fresh water, approximately 1.01 kilograms per liter. Dead Sea water reaches approximately 1.24 kilograms per liter because of the extraordinary concentration of dissolved minerals suspended within it. The difference appears numerically small, yet physically it transforms the entire relationship between water and the body. Submersion becomes almost impossible. A person attempting to sit upright in the Dead Sea finds the legs floating upward involuntarily while the torso tilts backward into a reclining position. Diving beneath the surface requires deliberate force and considerable discomfort. Even then, the body resists descent continuously, driven upward by buoyancy, stronger than almost any naturally accessible water environment on Earth. The famous image of tourists lying motionless while reading newspapers across the water is not performance or exaggeration. It is simply the posture the lake naturally imposes upon the human body. Ancient observers encountered something deeply unfamiliar here. Most human relationships with water are built around the expectation of immersion. Rivers allow bodies to sink beneath the surface. Oceans permit diving and swimming through depth. Lakes close around the body naturally when entered. The Dead Sea refuses this behavior entirely. It lifts bodies back toward the air with such persistence that ancient writers struggled to describe the experience without invoking supernatural language. Pliny the Elder wrote that floating objects could not be submerged even by force. His observation was entirely accurate. Without understanding dissolved mineral density or Archimedean displacement, he still recorded the phenomenon with remarkable precision. Water this dense generates upward force so continuously that ordinary assumptions about balance and movement cease to apply. The body becomes awkward within it. Swimming motions learned in ordinary water lose much of their usefulness because propulsion downward is constantly opposed by buoyancy. Turning over requires care. The surface presses against the chest and limbs unevenly. What appears peaceful from the shore contains a hidden instability created by the same mineral concentration responsible for the lake's lethal chemistry. This unusual buoyancy carries danger as well as fascination. There have been documented deaths in the Dead Sea caused not by conventional drowning, but by disorientation after accidental inversion. A person floating face upward who turns suddenly onto the stomach may struggle to rotate back because the dense water holds the body differently than ordinary lakes or oceans. Panic and exhaustion compound the difficulty. The same force that prevents sinking can also trap a body in positions difficult to correct quickly. Even safety behaves differently here. The density itself represents a direct physical measurement of geological accumulation. Every gram of dissolved mineral suspended within the lake entered through rivers, springs, or groundwater and remained after evaporation removed the water around it. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, bromide, and sodium gathered within the basin grain by grain across millions of years. The buoyancy experienced by the human body is therefore not merely a curiosity of physics, but the tactile expression of geological time. To float in the Dead Sea is to physically encounter the accumulated residue of an ancient landscape dissolving slowly into water over incomprehensible spans of history. Ancient travelers could not calculate density ratios or mineral concentrations, yet they understood instinctively that this water behaved unlike any other they had ever touched. Bodies that should sink refused to disappear beneath the surface. The lake rejected submersion itself. In an environment already stripped of fish, birds, and ordinary aquatic life, the physical behavior of the water reinforced the sense that the normal rules governing the world no longer operated here. The sensation remains unchanged today. Human skin still meets the same mineral weight. The body still rises involuntarily toward the surface. Beneath every floating visitor rests the invisible pressure of millions of years of evaporation, chemistry, and tectonic isolation, concentrated so completely that the water itself has become heavier than the flesh drifting upon it. Across thousands of years of recorded history, empires arrived at the shores of the Dead Sea, carrying different languages, different laws, and different gods. Yet the landscape forced each civilization into remarkably similar acts of interpretation. The cliffs, the silence, the lifeless water, the sulfur rising from the earth, the strange density that lifted the body against its will, all of it demanded explanation from human beings long before chemistry or geology existed as formal sciences. Around this single basin, three major religious traditions built narratives that treated the region not as ordinary geography, but as a boundary between the human world and something larger, harsher, and morally charged. For Judaism, the Dead Sea region became inseparable from foundational memory. The valley surrounding the lake held the stories of destroyed cities, of Lot and his fleeing family, of the pillar of salt standing motionless beside Catastrophe. The wilderness of Judea, stretching westward from the shoreline, became the landscape of prophets, exile, and retreat from civilization. The Jordan River descending toward the basin marked both physical and spiritual crossings within Hebrew tradition. In these stories, the desolation surrounding the lake was never symbolic decoration. It existed physically before every observer who preserved the narrative. The Essene community at Qumran deepened that connection deliberately. Choosing to live beside the Dead Sea meant choosing separation from ordinary society in one of the most severe environments available in the ancient Near East. The caves, cliffs, and dry wilderness offered isolation profound enough to support a community preparing spiritually for the transformation of the world itself. Their manuscripts, hidden above the mineral basin for 2,000 years, would eventually shape modern understanding of both Second Temple Judaism and the intellectual atmosphere from which Christianity emerged. Christianity inherited the same geography almost immediately. The Jordan River approaching the Dead Sea became the setting for the baptism of Jesus, an event understood within Christian tradition as the beginning of public ministry. Pilgrims still travel to the eastern bank near Qasr el-Yahud, where the river descends toward the lowest point on earth through desert terrain, already heavy with older sacred associations. The wilderness temptation narrative unfolds in this same surrounding landscape, among cliffs and barren valleys bordering the mineral basin. The desolation was not metaphorical. The desert around the Dead Sea genuinely stripped away ordinary signs of life. Silence, heat, exposed rock, and the absence of fertile vegetation created conditions naturally suited to traditions concerned with purification, testing, revelation, and withdrawal from worldly distraction. Spiritual language attached itself to the landscape because the landscape itself already felt separated from ordinary human habitation. Islam later inherited the same physical memory. Within Islamic tradition, the Dead Sea region is associated with the people of Lot, whose destruction appears in the Quran as a preserved warning visible in the earth itself. The ruined landscape beside the basin became not merely historical territory, but continuing evidence of divine judgment manifested physically within geography. Believers were instructed to observe these remains and recognize the consequences carried within them. The mineral wasteland surrounding the lake reinforced the narrative continuously through direct sensory experience. Yet, alongside judgment emerged another tradition entirely. In the book of Ezekiel appears a vision in which fresh water flows outward from Jerusalem and enters the Dead Sea, transforming it into living water filled with fish and movement. The prophecy imagines healing arriving precisely at the world's most persistently lifeless body of water. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic interpreters all preserved this vision in different forms because the Dead Sea represented the ultimate contrast between death and restoration. No ordinary lake could have carried such symbolic weight. The convergence of three faiths upon this single basin reflects the fact that the physical reality of the Dead Sea exceeded ordinary explanation for nearly all of recorded human history. Before mineral chemistry, tectonic theory, microbiology, or atmospheric science, people still encountered something unmistakably anomalous here. Water behaved differently, air behaved differently, life behaved differently. The landscape itself resisted comparison to surrounding environments. The name Dead, therefore, accumulated meanings layered upon one another across centuries. It described biology, chemistry, theology, memory, punishment, isolation, and prophecy simultaneously. Every tradition approaching the lake inherited not only earlier stories, but the same physical encounter with a place whose geology seemed to insist upon sacred interpretation. Long before microscopes revealed the invisible architecture of cells, the Dead Sea had already convinced nearly every civilization that encountered it that life could not exist here. Fish vanished at the river mouth. Plants failed along the mineral shoreline. Dead animals did not decay in familiar ways. The water burned, exposed skin, and resisted every ordinary expectation associated with lakes and rivers. Across thousands of years, observers reached the same conclusion because every visible form of life appeared absent from the basin. Yet, beneath that conclusion, hidden inside water saturated with magnesium salts and sealed beneath layers deprived of oxygen, another reality persisted quietly beyond human sight. Life existed here the entire time. Not abundant life in the ordinary sense, not forests of algae or swarms of visible organisms moving beneath the surface, but microbial forms so specialized that the conditions destroying almost everything else on Earth became necessary for their survival. The Dead Sea did not merely tolerate these organisms. It selected for them with almost impossible precision. Among the most remarkable is Halobacterium salinarum, a member of the Archaea domain, a lineage of life so ancient that its separation from bacteria and complex organisms fundamentally reshaped biology in the late 20th century. These microorganisms are built around chemistry almost opposite to that of ordinary cells. Their proteins require extreme salt concentrations to maintain structural stability. Remove them from hypersaline water and place them in the comparatively gentle chemistry of the ocean, and the proteins collapse, unfolding into dysfunction. The organism dies not because conditions are too hostile, but because they are suddenly too mild. The Dead Sea becomes not an exception to their biology, but the environment their biology expects. Dunaliella salina survives through another strategy entirely. Instead of resisting the osmotic pull surrounding it, the alga fills itself with glycerol, balancing its internal chemistry against the crushing concentration outside. Every moment of survival requires continuous metabolic effort. Energy is spent not on movement or growth in the ordinary sense, but on maintaining equilibrium against the surrounding mineral pressure. The organism survives by internalizing the chemistry that annihilates most cellular life. Under specific conditions, these microorganisms become briefly visible. After rare periods of rainfall dilute portions of the upper water, microbial populations can expand rapidly before the salinity intensifies once more. Pigments accumulate in astonishing concentrations, coloring parts of the lake red, pink, or orange. Ancient observers saw these transformations and interpreted them through theology, mythology, or fear. Yet, what they were witnessing was a biological bloom emerging temporarily from an environment usually too severe even for extremophiles to flourish openly. Deeper still, beyond the haloclines separating oxygenated surface water from the ancient anoxic depths, underwater exploration revealed another hidden layer of survival. Freshwater springs rise through fractures in the lake floor, pushing upward into hypersaline darkness and creating narrow boundaries where radically different chemistries collide. Around these invisible intersections, microbial communities gather in delicate turbulence. Life exists precisely where fresh water and concentrated brine meet, occupying one of the most chemically stressed habitats ever documented on Earth. These discoveries changed more than the understanding of the Dead Sea itself. For much of scientific history, environments this extreme were considered biologically prohibitive. The presence of functioning ecosystems within hypersaline, oxygen-poor, magnesium-rich water expanded the known boundaries of habitability across planetary science. Researchers studying the buried oceans of Europa and Enceladus began looking toward Earth's extremophiles for models of how life might persist beneath alien ice. The Dead Sea, once treated as the endpoint of biology, became part of the argument that biology may survive in places previously dismissed as sterile. Yet the ancient name remains strangely accurate. To every visible organism familiar to human observers, the Dead Sea is effectively lethal. The exceptions are microscopic, ancient, and chemically specialized beyond anything imaginable to the people who stood on these shores in antiquity. For 3,000 years, human beings described the basin honestly according to the evidence available to their senses. Only with modern instruments did another layer of the story emerge, revealing that even here, in water shaped for millions of years into one of the harshest environments on Earth, life continued searching patiently for the narrowest possible opening in the chemistry of death. At the edge of the retreating shoreline, where mineral crusts harden beneath desert heat and silence settles into the exposed sediment, the Dead Sea reveals a contradiction that ancient observers could witness but never fully explain. The same chemistry that destroys living tissue with startling speed also interrupts the ordinary processes that erase the dead. Death here does not flow naturally into decay. Something arrests the sequence midway, holding remnants of life in suspension long after they should have vanished into soil and bacteria. In most environments, decomposition is continuous and almost invisible. Microorganisms move through dead tissue, dismantling proteins, consuming fats, breaking apart cellular structures molecule by molecule until complex organisms dissolve back into the wider biological cycle. Fungi spread quietly through wood and leather. Bacteria bloom through exposed flesh. Insects arrive in ordered succession. Entire ecosystems depend on this exchange between death and renewal. Around the Dead Sea, that exchange fractures. The salinity that overwhelms living cells also overwhelms the decomposers responsible for dismantling them afterward. Bacteria entering the hypersaline water lose water through osmotic pressure, exactly as larger organisms do. Their membranes collapse, their metabolic machinery fails. Fungal growth slows almost to stillness. The organisms responsible for returning the dead back into the cycle of life are themselves destroyed by the same chemistry. The executioner and the undertaker become the same force. This is why organic material survives here with unusual persistence. Wood buried in shoreline sediment emerges centuries later, still recognizable in shape and texture. Leather fragments endure far beyond their expected lifespan. Fabrics survive in caves where ordinary climates would have reduced them to dust. Bone remains dry, mineralized, and startlingly intact beneath layers of salt and arid sediment. The preservation does not arise from magical properties hidden inside the minerals themselves, but from the absence of biological activity capable of completing decomposition. The Dead Sea does not preserve through protection. It preserves through exclusion. Even the air participates in this process. The deep basin traps heat and dryness together in one of the most arid environments on Earth. Moisture leaves exposed material rapidly, pulling water from tissue before microbial colonies can fully establish themselves. Natural mummification becomes possible, not through ritual, but through climate and chemistry operating continuously across centuries. Human remains recovered from caves and ancient settlements near the basin rank among the most remarkably preserved prehistoric specimens in the Middle East. Hair, skin, woven fibers, and fragments of biological tissue survive in conditions where wetter environments would have erased them completely. The surrounding landscape becomes less a graveyard than an archive, a place where the ordinary mechanisms of forgetting fail to function properly. The Dead Sea Scrolls remain the clearest expression of this paradox. Hidden inside sealed clay jars within the caves above the western shore, parchment manuscripts survived for nearly 2,000 years because the same environmental hostility that rendered the lake nearly lifeless also suppressed the organisms that would have consumed the scrolls. Ink endured on animal skin. Linen wrapping survived beside brittle wooden fragments. Entire texts crossed millennia, suspended between death and decay. The chemistry that annihilated fish in the water below simultaneously guarded language, memory, and scripture in the cliffs above. Human civilization discovered this principle long before understanding the biology beneath it. Salt became one of humanity's oldest preservation tools because people observed through repeated experience that salted food resisted spoilage. Meat packed in salt lasted through winters and voyages. Fish cured with minerals survived across continents. The Dead Sea represents this ancient intuition carried to its most extreme natural conclusion, an entire body of water transformed into a preservation environment by geological time. The paradox grows sharper the longer one lingers beside it. The lake destroys ordinary life almost immediately, yet it also conserves the evidence that life once existed nearby with extraordinary fidelity. It kills movement but preserves memory. It prevents survival while resisting erasure. Across thousands of years, the basin has accumulated not only minerals but traces of civilizations, fragments of organisms, abandoned structures, and biological records that would have disappeared almost anywhere else on Earth. The place named Dead has spent millions of years quietly keeping what the living world usually loses. Far beneath the still surface, under layers of mineral water that accumulated grain by grain across geological time, the floor of the Dead Sea has been quietly recording the history of Earth with extraordinary precision. Each season of rainfall, each drought, each dust storm carried from distant deserts settles eventually into the basin. Pollen drifts downward from vanished forests. Microscopic shells sink through the water column. Thin mineral bands crystallize during years of intense evaporation. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these materials formed stacked sediments like pages in an archive, preserving one of the most detailed environmental records anywhere in the Middle East. Scientists, extracting cores from the lakebed, discovered that the Dead Sea had been documenting climate long before human beings understood the concept of climate itself. Layer by layer, the sediments revealed ancient cycles of drought and rainfall stretching backward through immense spans of time. Isotopes trapped inside mineral deposits recorded shifts in temperature and evaporation. Pollen grains identified forests and grasslands that no longer exist. Periods when the lake expanded corresponded with wetter eras across the Levant. Periods when the shoreline retreated aligned with prolonged aridity and regional instability. One of the most striking correlations emerged from the late Bronze Age collapse, the great unraveling that transformed the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Civilizations fell almost simultaneously across vast distances. Trade networks fractured, cities burned or emptied, kingdoms vanished from history. Within the Dead Sea sediments, researchers identified a severe drought signal matching the timing of those collapses with unsettling clarity. The basin had preserved evidence of environmental stress while empires above it disappeared. The lake became not only a geological structure, but a witness. Elsewhere, another scientific revolution emerged from organisms surviving within its hostile chemistry. Studies of extremophiles from the Dead Sea contributed directly to the recognition that archaea represented an entirely separate domain of life, distinct from both bacteria and complex organisms. Before this discovery, biology divided life into far simpler categories. The existence of ancient microorganisms, thriving in conditions once considered impossible, forced scientists to redraw the tree of life itself. A hypersaline basin, long associated with death, became part of the evidence revealing how profoundly diverse life on Earth truly is. The influence extended even further outward, beyond Earth entirely. When planetary scientists began considering whether life might survive beneath the frozen surfaces of Europa or Enceladus, they searched for terrestrial environments that approached those chemical extremes. The Dead Sea became one of the crucial models. If microorganisms could adapt to magnesium-rich brines, oxygen deprivation, and overwhelming osmotic stress here, then perhaps biology elsewhere in the universe might persist inside alien oceans previously dismissed as sterile. Research programs connected to both NASA and the European Space Agency incorporated findings from Dead Sea extremophiles into the broader search for extraterrestrial habitability. The atmosphere above the basin also transformed medicine in unexpected ways. The unique filtering effect created by the deep elevation below sea level alters the spectrum of ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface. Combined with mineral-rich aerosols suspended in the air, these conditions produced measurable therapeutic benefits for certain skin disorders. Clinical treatment protocols for psoriasis and related conditions emerged from careful study of these environmental properties, turning a place historically associated with punishment into a scientifically validated site of healing. Even archaeology learned to read the chemistry of the lake. The unusual bromine to chlorine ratio found in Dead Sea water became a geological fingerprint, allowing researchers to trace ancient water systems and trade routes across the Near East. Reservoirs, ceramics, and hydraulic structures preserved chemical clues linking them back to the basin. The lake's mineral composition became a tool for reconstructing forgotten infrastructure from vanished societies. Centuries before modern laboratories existed, observers had already begun studying these properties systematically. The Greek physician Galen described therapeutic effects associated with the region during the 2nd century CE, beginning a chain of inquiry stretching uninterrupted into the present. Across thousands of years, the Dead Sea has remained an object of observation, measurement, and fascination. The irony settles gently across all of it. A lake named for death became one of the most scientifically productive bodies of water on Earth. From climate history to molecular biology, from medicine to astrobiology, the basin continued offering knowledge long after ancient people concluded that nothing living could emerge from its shores. Before sunrise reaches the floor of the Rift Valley, the plateau of Masada appears suspended between stone and sky, its cliffs falling sharply toward the pale mineral shoreline far below. From a distance, it resembles less a mountain than an isolated fragment of another landscape entirely, severed from the surrounding desert by erosion and tectonic time. The Dead Sea lies beneath it, like a sheet of metal without movement, dense and silent at the bottom of the deepest continental depression on Earth. Few places communicate isolation with such immediate physical clarity. It was precisely this isolation that drew human beings here. During the reign of Herod the Great, between roughly 37 and 31 BCE, Masada became the site of one of the most ambitious refuge complexes of the ancient world. Herod understood landscapes instinctively. He built fortresses not merely for defense but for psychological certainty, places where geography itself became an ally, stronger than armies. At Masada, he transformed a barren plateau above the world's deadest water into a self-contained sanctuary, stocked against catastrophe. The engineering remains astonishing even now. Storehouses stretched along the summit, filled with grain, oil, wine, and dried provisions intended to sustain inhabitants for years. Palaces descended in terraces along the northern cliff face, their balconies overlooking the immense emptiness of the Dead Sea basin below. Most extraordinary of all was the water system. In a landscape where rain arrived only rarely, enormous cisterns were carved directly into the rock with a combined capacity of approximately 40,000 cubic meters. During seasonal flash floods, channels and aqueducts diverted torrents from surrounding wadis into these reservoirs, capturing brief moments of abundance before the desert reclaimed them. Life on the summit depended entirely on anticipating scarcity. Everything surrounding Masada reinforced the logic of refuge. The Dead Sea offered neither food nor navigable transport. The surrounding wilderness resisted agriculture and settlement. Narrow paths, twisting upward through the cliffs, created natural bottlenecks, impossible for large armies to cross quickly. The same hostility that made the basin infamous also made it defensible. Geography itself became architecture. Decades later, after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, that architecture acquired another meaning entirely. A group of Jewish rebels, known as the Zealots, occupied Masada as one of the final holdouts against Rome. Ancient historian Josephus describes approximately 960 people living atop the plateau, while Roman forces encircled the mountain below. Around them stretched the desolation of the Dead Sea region, not as scenery, but as a boundary beyond which almost nothing survivable existed. The Roman response reshaped the valley floor permanently. Unable to storm the cliffs directly, Roman engineers constructed a massive siege ramp ascending toward the western side of the plateau, an incline of earth and stone still visible today from astonishing distances. Thousands of tons of material were moved beneath relentless desert heat. Historical accounts suggest Jewish prisoners of war were forced into the labor specifically because defenders atop the cliffs would hesitate to attack workers drawn from their own people. The siege became not only military engineering but psychological warfare carved directly into the landscape. From the summit, the relationship between Masada and the Dead Sea becomes unmistakable. The fortress could exist only because the surrounding region was so inhospitable. An army trapped elsewhere might retreat toward fertile valleys or navigable rivers. Here there was nowhere left to withdraw. The water below killed almost everything entering it. The desert beyond offered little shelter. Masada functioned as the final inhabitable surface above a geography already associated with endings. Yet human beings built beauty here anyway. Mosaic floors, painted walls, bathhouses, storerooms, workshops, and carefully planned living quarters rose above one of the harshest environments on Earth. The contradiction settles gently into the stone itself. A landscape defined for millennia by death and desolation became simultaneously a place where people concentrated extraordinary effort, preserving life, memory, and continuity against impossible odds. Looking outward from Masada at dawn, with the mineral haze suspended above the Dead Sea and the valley sinking away beneath the cliffs, the logic becomes visible all at once. The hostility was never incidental. The hostility was the fortress. At the shoreline of most lakes, life announces itself before the water even becomes visible. Reeds shift in shallow currents. Insects hover above the surface in dense moving clouds. Fish disturb the water from below with sudden circles of motion. Birds gather at the edges where plants meet mud. Even still, water carries small biological sounds, the layered texture of living systems operating continuously at the boundary between land and water. Human beings learned to recognize these patterns long before science explained them. Living water possessed movement, noise, smell, growth, and recurrence. The Dead Sea removes almost all of it. The silence encountered along its shore is not ordinary quietness, it is a subtraction. Ancient observers approaching the basin would have recognized the absence instinctively, even if they lacked language for the chemistry behind it. There are no schools of fish breaking the surface, no dense vegetation extending to the waterline, no thriving wetlands crowded with amphibians or insects. The surrounding desert already strips sound from the landscape, but the water deepens the effect further by withholding the ordinary signals associated with aquatic life everywhere else on Earth. The lake feels biologically unfinished. This is what the ancient name was attempting to describe. The phrase Dead Sea has become so familiar through centuries of repetition that its precision often disappears beneath habit, yet the naming itself was remarkably exact. Human beings were not assigning poetry to the basin, they were recording an observation. In Hebrew, the phrase Yam Hamavet carries weight beyond simple biological death. Hebrew language roots the word mavet not merely in the moment life ceases, but in death as a condition, an enduring state rather than a temporary event. The meaning approaches something closer to the sea of death itself, not simply a place where organisms die, but a place fundamentally characterized by the qualities associated with lifelessness. Other cultures reached similar conclusions independently. Greek writers named it the asphalt lake because the black bitumen defined its commercial identity, yet they also described its sterility, buoyancy, and absence of fish with striking consistency. Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and later European traditions converged repeatedly on the same underlying idea. This was not a sacred river named for a deity, nor a lake named after a nearby settlement or ruler. The defining feature across civilizations became the condition of the water itself. That pattern is unusual in human geography. Most bodies of water inherit names from people, tribes, nearby cities, colors, or shapes. The Dead Sea instead inherited a diagnosis. Every civilization encountering it felt compelled to describe what the water appeared to be rather than who possessed it. The basin resisted assimilation into ordinary categories so completely that its physical behavior became its identity. Modern science eventually revealed how accurate those ancient observations were. The water does not merely discourage life. Its chemistry attacks the fundamental mechanisms supporting cellular existence. Osmotic pressure extracts water from cells. Magnesium ions destabilize enzymes and membranes. The density alters the behavior of bodies floating at the surface. The anoxic depths suppress decomposition. Even the atmosphere above the basin differs measurably from surrounding regions. The place ancient observers called dead turned out to be chemically, biologically, and geologically singular. Yet the deepest precision of the name lies elsewhere. Nothing killed the Dead Sea in the ordinary sense. The basin was not once alive in its current form and later transformed by catastrophe into sterility. Rather, over millions of years, tectonic separation, relentless evaporation, mineral accumulation, and climatic drying assembled conditions increasingly hostile to complex life. Geological forces constructed a body of water defined by lifelessness long before recorded history began. The word dead, therefore, describes not an event, but an architecture. Ancient people standing beside the lake lacked microscopes, chemistry, geology, and molecular biology, yet they recognized the final condition with remarkable clarity. They understood that this water represented an absence so complete it demanded naming directly. The name endured because every generation arriving at the shore encountered the same conclusion, waiting silently in the mineral air. Dead was not metaphor. Dead was observation refined into language. Across the earth, there are many places where water and salt have entered into long relationships with heat, evaporation, and time. White mineral plains spread across deserts in Bolivia and Botswana. Shallow inland seas in Utah darken with algae blooms and dense microbial life. Harsh lakes in Djibouti shimmer beneath volcanic landscapes, where temperatures climb through relentless afternoons. Human beings have stood beside all of them and recognized hostility in varying degrees. Yet almost nowhere else did entire civilizations settle upon the same singular conclusion reached beside the Dead Sea. They did not call the others dead. The difference reveals something essential. The Great Salt Lake is among the closest comparisons available. Its northern waters can rise to salinity levels far beyond ordinary seawater, especially during periods of drought when evaporation concentrates the dissolved minerals. Yet even there, the lake remains biologically active. Brine shrimp drift through the water in impossible numbers, sustaining migratory bird populations so vast that seasonal migrations transform the shoreline into one of the most important avian habitats in North America. Halophilic microbes color parts of the lake red and violet beneath the desert sun. Algae blooms appear and disappear with seasonal cycles. Life persists openly and continuously. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Lake Assal reaches salinity levels that occasionally rival or exceed portions of the Dead Sea itself, yet microbial communities survive along its margins. The Salar de Uyuni and the Bonneville salt flats are equally severe in their own ways. Immense landscapes where mineral concentration dominates the horizon, but none acquired a reputation for universal biological death across millennia of human observation. Salt alone was never the full story. The crucial distinction lies hidden at the molecular level, in the specific chemistry dissolved invisibly through the water. Most hypersaline environments on Earth are dominated primarily by sodium chloride, the same mineral combination defining ordinary ocean water. Biological systems possess deep evolutionary familiarity with sodium chloride. Oceans shaped the chemistry of living cells across hundreds of millions of years. High concentrations create stress, certainly, but specialized organisms developed mechanisms capable of surviving within them. The Dead Sea crossed into something fundamentally different. Its waters became dominated not by sodium chloride, but by magnesium chloride, a compound far more disruptive to cellular machinery. Magnesium ions interfere directly with enzymes, destabilize membranes, and disrupt the electrochemical balance sustaining living cells. Organisms adapted for sodium chloride hypersalinity encounter an entirely different chemical assault here, one striking simultaneously at multiple biological systems rather than merely extracting water through osmotic pressure alone. This is why comparison by salinity percentage misses the deeper truth. Two lakes may contain similar concentrations of dissolved minerals while possessing entirely different biological consequences, depending on what those minerals actually are. The Dead Sea did not become uniquely hostile because it simply accumulated more salt than everywhere else. It became uniquely hostile because millions of years of geological isolation assembled an unusually specific recipe. Water entering the basin dissolved minerals from surrounding limestone, basalt, and ancient evaporite formations before becoming trapped within a sealed rift where evaporation removed water but preserved everything dissolved inside it. Over immense spans of time, the chemistry drifted further from ordinary marine systems and deeper into something biologically unfamiliar. The basin effectively concentrated geological history into liquid form. No other lake followed precisely the same path. The tectonic structure beneath the valley, the mineral composition of the surrounding rocks, the desert climate, the absence of an outlet, and the prolonged accumulation of magnesium-rich inflow combined into a singular environmental identity that exists nowhere else on Earth in exactly the same configuration. The Dead Sea is therefore not merely extreme, it is specific. That specificity explains why ancient naming traditions separated this lake from all others. Human beings living beside the Great Salt Lake, Lake Assal, or other hypersaline environments still observed visible ecosystems clinging to the margins. Birds arrived, Insects gathered. Life announced itself despite the harshness. At the Dead Sea, the silence remained more complete. The name dead emerged because this particular chemistry crossed a threshold ancient observers could recognize immediately, even without understanding its molecular cause. Millions of years of geology assembled a lake whose hostility became visible to every civilization that encountered it, and no other salt lake on Earth carried precisely the same verdict written so clearly across its water. Long before chemistry possessed names for bromides, magnesium salts, or hydrocarbons, caravans were already moving across the Jordan Valley carrying pieces of the Dead Sea into the economies of kingdoms. The strange water at the bottom of the rift did not merely inspire fear or theological reflection. It produced materials so useful, so difficult to obtain elsewhere, that entire trade systems formed around a landscape most people considered hostile to life itself. The paradox settled quietly into the foundations of civilization. The deadest body of water on Earth became one of the ancient world's most productive industrial resources. Along the shoreline, where evaporation built white mineral crusts across stone and mud, salt accumulated in visible abundance. In the ancient world, salt was not seasoning alone. It preserved meat and fish against decay, protected food supplies through drought and winter, stabilized trade routes, and sustained armies traveling far from agricultural centers. Human societies measured wealth through access to reliable salt sources because biological survival itself depended upon preservation. The Dead Sea offered seemingly endless quantities of it, concentrated by geological time and laid bare beneath desert heat. The Latin word salarium, from which the modern word salary eventually emerged, reflected this ancient intimacy between salt and economic life. Here beside the Dead Sea, that relationship became almost architectural. Mineral terraces formed naturally along the retreating shoreline, while shallow basins concentrated crystalline deposits thick enough to harvest directly. The same chemistry that erased fish and aquatic plants from the water produced one of the most valuable commodities in human history at extraordinary scale. Yet salt was only the beginning. Black asphalt, rising from the depths, drifted onto the surface in massive, floating bodies that ancient observers compared to shattered islands or overturned boats. Workers approached them carefully, cutting away chunks of bitumen for transport north and south across the Near East. Egyptian embalmers used Dead Sea asphalt in mummification processes whose traces remain chemically identifiable thousands of years later. Waterproofing compounds for ships, binding materials for construction, medicinal preparations, and sealing agents all emerged from the same submerged geological reservoirs beneath the lake floor. The Dead Sea's industrial identity extended further into compounds ancient people could observe without fully understanding. Potassium-rich minerals concentrated in shoreline deposits enhanced agricultural fertility when carried into cultivated regions. Glassmaking and soap production relied upon alkaline substances extracted from evaporite sediments. Sulfur gathered from surrounding formations entered fumigation practices, preservation methods, and early chemical experimentation long before chemistry existed as a formal science. The landscape itself behaved like an exposed mineral laboratory assembled by tectonic forces over millions of years. Trade routes followed naturally. Caravans moved along desert corridors, linking the Dead Sea to Egypt, Mesopotamia, Arabia, and Mediterranean ports. The Nabateans, masters of long-distance desert commerce, integrated Dead Sea resources into networks stretching across enormous distances. Asphalt from the Rift Valley reached embalming chambers beside the Nile. Salt harvested beneath Judean cliffs preserved food far from the basin that produced it, materials extracted from a biologically lethal environment quietly entered ordinary human life across multiple civilizations. Even the therapeutic qualities associated with the region became economically significant. Mineral-rich muds and waters were used medicinally from at least the Roman period onward. Ancient writers describe treatments for skin conditions, joint pain, and respiratory ailments connected to the peculiar chemistry and atmosphere surrounding the lake. Stories surrounding Cleopatra and her reported interest in Dead Sea cosmetics may contain embellishment, yet they reflect a genuine commercial reality. Products derived from this landscape possessed prestige throughout the ancient world, precisely because nowhere else produced them in quite the same way. The contradiction deepened with every century. Biological death and economic vitality became inseparable here. The minerals that preserved mummies were the same minerals preventing ordinary decomposition along the shoreline. The compounds sealing ships against water emerged from water itself so hostile that almost nothing could inhabit it. Fertilizers enriching distant fields originated from a basin incapable of sustaining crops beside its own edge. Civilizations survived partly because of materials extracted from a lake they simultaneously feared. The ancient economy surrounding the Dead Sea therefore reveals something deeper than trade alone. Human beings learned that the same geological forces capable of building extreme hostility could also create extraordinary usefulness. Death itself became resource, chemistry became commerce, and the silent water at the bottom of the rift entered history not only as a warning or a mystery, but as one of the ancient world's most valuable gifts. Before any civilization attached theology to this basin, before chemistry identified magnesium chloride or geology mapped tectonic faults beneath the valley floor, there was simply the experience itself. A human being descending through desert heat toward an unfamiliar body of water encountered something that did not behave like expectation. The Dead Sea announced its difference immediately, long before explanation arrived. The senses understood first. From a distance, the water appears almost exaggerated in color, turquoise shifting toward deep mineral blue beneath the white glare of salt and desert stone. Yet the color alone is not what unsettles perception. It is the stillness carried within it. Ordinary lakes and seas constantly reveal movement through ripples, scattered reflections, small interruptions crossing the surface from fish, birds, insects, or wind. The Dead Sea often appears to hold itself motionless. In calm conditions, the surface becomes strangely dense in appearance, almost metallic, almost viscous, as though the water has thickened into something halfway between liquid and mineral. The surrounding silence deepens the impression before the mind consciously identifies why. At the edge of most water on Earth, there exists a familiar layer of biological sound. Insects drift and vibrate above reeds. Birds move through shoreline vegetation. Amphibians call from shallow margins. Fish disturb the surface with sudden flashes and rings of motion. Even isolated lakes carry the subtle acoustics of metabolism. Here those sounds fall away almost completely. Wind moves across stone and salt, but the ordinary language of living water remains absent. A person standing at the shoreline registers the lack instinctively, the same way the body notices when a familiar mechanical sound inside a house suddenly stops during the night. Then the smell arrives. Ancient Greek writers described sulfurous air rising from the basin, and the sensation remains recognizable thousands of years later. Heat lifts mineral vapors from the shoreline, while traces of bitumen and sulfur compounds drift invisibly upward from geological layers below. It is not the overwhelming smell of decay, but something drier and stranger, mineral mixed with faint combustion, an odor suggesting exposed geology rather than ordinary water. The earth itself seems closer to the surface here. The shoreline reinforces the impression further. Salt accumulates not as a thin crust, but as architecture. White crystalline shelves project outward into the water. Jagged mineral ridges rise from shallow margins like frozen waves. Some formations resemble branches, coral, bone, or unfinished sculpture. Under intense sunlight, the salt reflects with almost unnatural brightness against the darker desert cliffs beyond. The contrast between turquoise water, white mineral growth, and red stone creates a landscape ancient observers would have struggled to compare to anything familiar elsewhere in the world. Touch removes any remaining illusion that this is ordinary water. The hand encounters resistance immediately. The density becomes physical before it becomes intellectual. Water normally yields effortlessly around fingers and skin, yet the Dead Sea presses back with unusual weight. Wading deeper transforms the sensation further. The body begins floating almost involuntarily, legs lifting upward without effort, balance shifting into unfamiliar positions. People encountering this, without knowledge of density or buoyancy, would have experienced the behavior as something deeply unnatural, a liquid refusing to behave according to every prior memory of rivers or lakes. Then comes the burning. Even the smallest abrasion becomes known instantly once exposed to the water. Cuts invisible moments earlier announce themselves through sharp mineral pain as concentrated salts draw moisture from exposed tissue. Eyes, lips, and sensitive skin react immediately. The chemistry communicates directly with the nervous system in a language requiring no translation. This place is hostile in a manner impossible to misunderstand. Ancient people arriving here, therefore, did not reason their way toward the name dead through abstract philosophy or slow investigation. The conclusion emerged from accumulated sensation. The wrong silence, the wrong smell, the wrong movement of the water, the strange buoyancy, the burning contact, the absence of visible life, and the sight of fish dying when carried downstream from the Jordan River combined into a single, coherent experience delivered directly through the body itself. The Dead Sea explained its nature before anyone possessed words capable of explaining it scientifically. There are landscapes whose reality becomes clearer the closer one moves toward measurement. The Dead Sea belongs to this category. For thousands of years, human beings described it through sensation, theology, fear, and metaphor. Yet, eventually instruments arrived beside the shoreline and began translating the same strangeness into numbers. What emerged was not the destruction of mystery, but its refinement. Every measurement confirmed that the ancient intuition had been accurate. Something genuinely unusual existed here. The northern basin descends to a maximum depth of approximately 304 meters, making it the deepest hypersaline lake on Earth. Beneath the turquoise surface lies a vertical column of mineral-rich water extending downward into darkness, more typical of ocean trenches than inland lakes. Yet depth alone does not define the place. Many lakes are deep. The Dead Sea combines depth with concentration, isolation, and geological confinement in a way found nowhere else. Its water contains approximately 342 grams of dissolved minerals per liter. Average ocean water contains roughly 35. Nearly 10 times the mineral load exists here, suspended invisibly through every movement of the basin. Each handful of water carries the accumulated residue of millions of years during which inflowing rivers arrived, evaporated beneath desert heat, and left their dissolved contents behind. The chemistry became history made liquid. The composition of those minerals tells the deeper story. Approximately half of the dissolved material consists of magnesium chloride, the compound responsible for much of the lake's uniquely hostile biological character. Sodium chloride, The dominant mineral of ordinary seawater forms only about 1/3 of the dissolved load. Calcium chloride contributes another substantial fraction, followed by potassium compounds, bromine, sulfur, and traces of numerous additional elements. The proportions matter profoundly. The Dead Sea is not merely concentrated ocean water. It is chemically transformed water, altered through geological isolation into something biologically unfamiliar. The current salinity approaches approximately 1/3 of the water itself. Ancient observers could not measure percentages, yet they encountered the consequences directly through burning skin, floating bodies, and the absence of visible aquatic life. Modern chemistry simply quantified what human senses had already recognized. Density reveals the transformation physically. Fresh water possesses a density close to 1 kilogram per liter. Dead Sea water approaches approximately 1¼ kilograms per liter. That additional mass exists because dissolved minerals occupy the water in astonishing quantities. Human bodies entering the basin encounter not abstraction, but immediate physical resistance. The buoyancy famous throughout history emerges directly from arithmetic written into the liquid itself. The surrounding landscape carries equally extraordinary measurements. The shoreline rests approximately 430 meters below sea level, the lowest exposed land surface anywhere on Earth. This depth was not produced suddenly, but through approximately 25 million years of tectonic sinking as the Arabian and African plates slowly shifted past one another. The valley floor has been descending longer than humanity has existed. Climate completed the trap. Annual evaporation removes roughly 1,400 to 1,500 millimeters of water from the basin each year, among the highest evaporation rates measured anywhere on Earth. Rainfall contributes only a tiny fraction in return, approximately 50 to 75 millimeters annually. The imbalance is immense and relentless. More water leaves through the atmosphere than enters through rain by a margin so extreme that concentration becomes inevitable. The hypersaline lake, recognizable today, formed approximately 3 to 5 million years ago, though the tectonic depression containing it is vastly older. Deep beneath the surface, isolated anoxic water layers may have remained unmixed for thousands of years or longer, sealed beneath denser mineral strata like submerged archives untouched by ordinary circulation. Taken separately, these figures might appear clinical. Together, they form a portrait of a geological mechanism operating across incomprehensible spans of time. Depth, density, evaporation, salinity, mineral composition, tectonic descent, and climatic imbalance all converge toward the same conclusion. The Dead Sea is not an accident of water alone. It is a physical equation written slowly across millions of years until the result became so extreme that ancient human beings required only a glance to recognize what had formed here. Far beneath the mineral surface, in water ancient observers believed completely abandoned by life, microscopic organisms continue carrying out the oldest activity on Earth. They absorb energy, maintain fragile boundaries against hostile chemistry, divide, adapt, and persist. The Dead Sea, despite everything written into its name, ultimately reveals not the absence of life, but the astonishing distance life is willing to travel in order to continue existing. Human beings tend to imagine survival through familiar scales: forests recovering after fire, animals enduring winter, seeds waiting beneath drought. Yet the organisms inhabiting the Dead Sea belong to a deeper category entirely. They are not enduring temporary hardship. They are structurally adapted to conditions lethal to almost every visible form of biology on Earth. Salt concentrations destroying ordinary cells become necessities for their own existence. Magnesium-rich water destabilizing most membranes becomes the environment within which their proteins fold correctly and their chemistry remains possible. The implication reaches beyond microbiology into something more fundamental about life itself. The Dead Sea demonstrates that biology does not obey human intuitions about what environments should permit survival. Life is not delicate in the way human language often describes it. It is opportunistic, chemically inventive, and persistent across timescales far exceeding human history. The extremophiles inhabiting this basin are descendants of evolutionary lineages adapting gradually through immense spans of time, generation after generation, refining molecular strategies capable of functioning where almost nothing else can. These organisms are not anomalies standing outside biology. They are biology revealing its full range. The discovery of archaea as a separate domain of life emerged partly from studying organisms in places like the Dead Sea, environments once assumed too hostile to contain meaningful ecosystems. Scientists realized that some of the planet's oldest evolutionary lineages possessed biochemical architectures radically different from familiar plants, animals, and bacteria. The tree of life itself expanded because of what was found inside water humanity had named dead for thousands of years. The lesson carried outward into planetary science almost immediately. If life persisted here, then perhaps environments once dismissed elsewhere in the universe required reconsideration as well. Subsurface oceans beneath the icy crust of Europa or Enceladus no longer seemed automatically impossible. Briny groundwater beneath Martian rock formations became worthy of renewed attention. The Dead Sea quietly altered the scientific imagination regarding where biology might survive. At the same time, the lake reveals something equally important about death. Human beings often think of death as event, catastrophe, interruption. Something alive ceases abruptly because of violence, disease, or disaster. Yet the Dead Sea emerged through a completely different process. No single moment transformed a thriving ecosystem into sudden lifelessness. Instead, the basin drifted gradually across geological time toward increasing concentration, increasing isolation, increasing hostility. Minerals accumulated grain by grain. Evaporation exceeded rainfall year after year. Tectonic sinking deepened the basin meter by meter. The present chemistry emerged not from destruction alone, but from accumulation. The name dead, therefore, contains a subtle misunderstanding inherited across languages. It suggests a lake that once possessed ordinary life and then lost it. Scientific reality reveals something slower and stranger. The Dead Sea has been moving toward its current condition for millions of years through physical laws entirely indifferent to human categories of life and death. Geological processes produced chemistry. Chemistry shaped biological possibility, and human beings later attached emotional language to the result. Yet ancient cultures were still correct in recognizing the place as boundary. Every civilization encountering the Dead Sea understood instinctively that ordinary rules weakened here. Water behaved differently, silence behaved differently, preservation and decay behaved differently. Even the relationship between human bodies and the lake felt altered. The basin existed at the edge of familiar experience, and human cultures consistently assign meaning to edges. Sacred deserts, polar ice fields, volcanic mountains, eclipses, caves, and deep oceans all acquire symbolic gravity because anomaly attracts interpretation. The Dead Sea became spiritually dense for the same reason it became chemically dense. It was a sealed system with no outlet, Minerals accumulated because they could not escape. Stories, fears, religions, and meanings accumulated for precisely the same reason. Human attention entered this basin and remained there, layer after layer, across thousands of years, until the lake became not merely a geographical feature, but a mirror reflecting how human beings understand the limits of life itself. Long before chemistry had names, before tectonic plates were understood, before microorganisms invisible to the naked eye were discovered drifting through hostile water, human beings stood on the shores of this lake and arrived at a conclusion that endured across thousands of years and dozens of languages. Something about this place was fundamentally incompatible with ordinary life. Fish entering from the Jordan River died almost immediately. Birds avoided the shoreline. Vegetation stopped short of the water's edge. The lake floated bodies unnaturally high and burned open skin with mineral intensity. Ancient people called it dead because every sense available to them reported the same thing. Yet the deeper answer hidden beneath that name required millions of years to assemble. The question itself contains an assumption. To ask what killed the Dead Sea suggests that somewhere in the distant past there existed a living lake, abundant and biologically ordinary, before some catastrophe transformed it into the mineral basin known today. Human language naturally frames death as transition. Something lives, something happens, something ends. But the Dead Sea does not follow that narrative. Its history begins not with death, but with separation. Around 25 million years ago, the Arabian and African tectonic plates began slowly pulling apart, opening a deep fracture through the crust of the earth. The basin forming between them continued sinking over immense spans of geological time, eventually becoming the lowest exposed land surface on the planet. Water flowed inward, but no river flowed outward. From the very beginning, the geography behaved like a trap. Climate completed what tectonics began. The surrounding desert delivered extreme evaporation and very little rainfall. Under ordinary conditions, lakes balance inflow and outflow, constantly exchanging water with surrounding systems. The Dead Sea Basin could not do this. Water entered, carrying dissolved minerals from limestone, basalt, sulfur deposits, and ancient evaporite sediments, then disappeared into the sky under relentless heat, leaving the minerals behind. Every year, the concentration increased slightly. Every century deepened the chemistry further. Nothing dramatic occurred. No singular catastrophe poisoned the basin overnight. The transformation unfolded gradually through accumulation. Grain by grain, molecule by molecule, the water crossed thresholds invisible to human observation. First merely salty, then hostile, then increasingly selective about what forms of biology could survive within it. The specific chemistry mattered as much as the concentration itself. Other hypersaline lakes support visible ecosystems because their mineral balance remains dominated by sodium chloride, a chemistry many organisms evolved mechanisms to tolerate. The Dead Sea followed a different path. Magnesium chloride accumulated in extraordinary quantities, destabilizing proteins and cellular machinery at a level categorically harsher than ordinary saltwater hypersalinity. Over geological time, the basin assembled one of the most chemically restrictive aquatic environments on Earth. What ancient observers eventually encountered was not the aftermath of death, but the completion of a process. The lake they named dead had never truly been alive in the familiar ecological sense implied by the word. It had been moving steadily toward this condition for millions of years, shaped by tectonic sinking, desert climate, mineral-rich geology, and relentless evaporation. The final chemistry emerged from physical laws operating long before human beings existed and long before life itself appeared on Earth. In that sense, the ancient name was more accurate than anyone could have understood at the time. The Dead Sea was not murdered. It was constructed. Geology carved the basin. Climate concentrated the minerals. Chemistry determined the limits of survival. Time carried the process forward without urgency and without intention. The forces responsible were not malicious, divine, or symbolic. They were indifferent. Continental plates separated because tectonic systems move. Water evaporated because desert air remained dry. Minerals accumulated because there was nowhere else for them to go. What really killed the Dead Sea was the same thing that made it possible in the first place: time, geology, chemistry, and the complete indifference of the planet to whether living things can endure the environments it creates. Before sunrise fully reaches the basin, the Dead Sea exists in a suspended state between darkness and mineral light. The surrounding desert remains muted and cold, the cliffs across the water holding faint traces of red beneath the first pale illumination, while the shoreline itself begins to glow long before the sun clears the horizon. Salt catches light differently than stone or sand. The crystalline formations scattered along the edge of the water seem almost internally illuminated, white against turquoise so dark it approaches black in the deeper sections, every surface sharpened by the dryness of the air. At this hour, the tourist beaches are empty, the concrete walkways silent, and the lake reveals the older version of itself that ancient travelers would still recognize immediately. Nothing moves very much. The water does not behave like ordinary lakes. In calm weather, its surface suppresses the small, chaotic animations expected from liquid. There are no rippling schools of fish beneath the reflection, no insects touching down across the shallows, no reeds bending at the margins. The density smooths motion into something heavy and restrained. From certain angles, the lake appears less like water than polished mineral stretched across the floor of the rift. The horizon line between water and atmosphere softens until reflection and landscape become difficult to separate. Then the silence begins to register fully. Not ordinary silence, not the temporary absence of human noise, but the removal of an entire layer of biological sound that normally surrounds water everywhere else on Earth. There are no gulls circling overhead, no frogs hidden among reeds, no splashing movements beneath the surface. Even distant insects seem reduced by the chemistry and aridity of the basin. The brain notices the absence before language catches up to it. Every shoreline humanity evolved beside carried these sounds continuously across hundreds of thousands of years of human history. At the Dead Sea, they are gone. The smell drifting through the morning air remains faintly sulfurous and metallic, carried upward from the same geological systems that produced asphalt seeps and mineral springs thousands of years ago. Greek geographers describe this scent in surviving texts from the ancient world. Medieval pilgrims wrote of it with unease. Modern visitors encounter precisely the same air. Across empires, religions, languages, and scientific revolutions, the physical experience has remained almost unchanged. Standing here means occupying several different scales of time simultaneously. Beneath the shoreline, the tectonic rift continues its slow movement, continental plates separating by distances too small for the body to perceive, yet large enough to reshape landscapes over millions of years. The lake beside you contains microorganisms descended from lineages so ancient they helped redefine the biological understanding of life itself. The atmosphere overhead presses slightly heavier against the lungs because this basin lies farther below sea level than any other exposed place on the planet. Every sensation has a measurable physical explanation, yet the accumulation of those explanations does not reduce the strangeness. If anything, the knowledge sharpens it. Human history settles here quietly rather than dramatically. Nabatean traders once moved along these shores, carrying bitumen north and west through desert caravan routes. Roman soldiers raised camps above the basin, while siege ramps climbed toward Masada, stone by stone. Essene scribes sealed fragile manuscripts inside clay jars and hid them in caves overlooking the water below. Pilgrims arrived carrying sacred stories already centuries old. Shepherds wandered through the cliffs and heard pottery shatter in hidden chambers. All of them stood somewhere within this same landscape, breathing the same mineral air, watching light strike the same unnatural water. None of those people needed chemistry, microbiology, or geology to understand that the place before them was different from every other lake they had ever known. The conclusion arrived through the senses first, and through language only afterward. They called it dead because the water itself communicated that fact directly, consistently, and without ambiguity to every civilization that ever reached its shore. A sealed basin is a simple geological structure. Water enters, water cannot escape, and whatever arrives remains behind. Over immense spans of time, the consequences become visible. Minerals accumulate, density increases, chemistry intensifies. The Dead Sea appears at first to be only the most extreme version of this process, a depression in the earth where evaporation exceeded renewal for millions of years. Yet standing beside it long enough reveals that the basin contains more than water and salt. It contains a way of thinking about existence itself. The ancient name survives because it succeeded in describing reality with unusual precision. Most geographical names drift away from their original meanings over centuries of translation and mythology. Rivers are named for forgotten rulers. Mountains inherit the language of vanished cultures. Cities outlive the events that first defined them. But the Dead Sea remains exactly what human beings first called it. Without microbiology, chemistry, or geology, ancient observers identified the essential truth of the place through direct experience alone. The water lacked the signs associated everywhere else with living systems. No fish moved beneath the surface. No vegetation crowded the shoreline. No birds nested along the water's edge. The name was not symbolic first and scientific later. It was empirical from the beginning. That accuracy becomes more striking the deeper science looks into the basin. Even the rare organisms surviving here altered humanity's understanding of biology itself. The extremophiles, inhabiting hidden freshwater interfaces and hypersaline layers, demonstrated that life extends far beyond the conditions once considered habitable. Organisms from the Dead Sea helped force biology to redraw the boundaries, separating survivable from impossible. The discovery carried consequences reaching beyond Earth. When astrobiologists imagine microbial ecosystems beneath the frozen oceans of Europa or within ancient Martian brines, part of the intellectual foundation for those possibilities began here, inside a lake, once considered too hostile for meaningful biology of any kind. The basin also changes the scale at which time is felt. Human civilization measures itself in dynasties, scriptures, wars, and migrations. The Dead Sea measures itself in tectonic motion and mineral deposition. The plates beneath the Jordan Rift began separating roughly 25 million years ago. Entire languages appeared and vanished while the basin continued sinking millimeter by millimeter. Ancient kingdoms rose around shores already ancient beyond comprehension. Every culture that named the lake inherited a landscape older than memory itself. The discrepancy between geological time and human time becomes physically visible here. Cliffs, salt formations, and mineral layers expose durations too large for ordinary intuition to comfortably contain, meaning accumulated here the same way minerals did. Cultures surrounding the basin attempted to explain what exceeded ordinary experience. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all folded this landscape into sacred narrative because the place demanded interpretation. Human beings consistently attach significance to environments that resist familiar categories. The Dead Sea resisted nearly all of them. Water that floated bodies unnaturally high, preserved manuscripts for thousands of years, burned wounds immediately, and supported almost no visible life, could not remain spiritually neutral in the imagination of the people living beside it. The basin had no outlet physically, and so meanings remained suspended here, generation after generation, settling into theology, folklore, pilgrimage, and memory. The lake also exposes the limits of the word death itself. Human beings understand death primarily as event. Something lives, then stops living. A transition occurs. An absence replaces a presence. Geological reality does not operate according to that emotional structure. The Dead Sea was never alive in the ecological sense implied by its name. It became what it is through accumulation rather than catastrophe, through physics rather than violence. Yet the word dead remains correct because human language lacks a more honest term for a place where the ordinary signatures of life disappear so completely. In the end, the basin teaches something both simple and difficult to fully absorb. A planet does not construct environments according to whether living things can endure them. Mountains rise, deserts dry, tectonic plates separate, minerals dissolve, and water evaporates according to physical laws indifferent to comfort or survival. Life adapts where it can. Meaning follows afterward. The Dead Sea is what remains when geology continues long enough without release, a sealed basin where chemistry, time, and human understanding settled together and never entirely escaped again. Night settles over the basin slowly, the remaining heat of the desert lifting into the darkened air, while the water below absorbs the last traces of color from the sky. The cliffs across the eastern shore fade first into shadow, then into outline, until only the pale mineral edges along the shoreline continue reflecting light beneath the stars. At this hour, the Dead Sea becomes almost entirely soundless. Not the soft quietness of forests or snowfall, but a more specific absence shaped by chemistry and density. Ordinary lakes continue whispering after sunset through reeds, insects, waves, and living movement beneath the surface. Here, those familiar layers disappear. The mineral-heavy atmosphere softens distant echoes, and the water itself presses against the shore with barely any sound at all. The lake remains awake, even in stillness. Far below the surface, beneath the turquoise layer seen by visitors during the day, the deeper anoxic water continues its slow chemical work. Minerals settle downward grain by grain through darkness that sunlight never reaches. Dense brines remain isolated from the world above, exactly as they have for thousands of years, sealed beneath the halocline in cold suspension. Nothing hurries there. The chemistry moves according to physical laws operating on timescales too large for human intuition to comfortably follow. The basin keeps concentrating itself patiently, molecule after molecule, exactly as it has since the desert closed around it millions of years ago. Elsewhere along the lake bed, hidden freshwater springs continue rising invisibly through cracks in the earth. Around those narrow interfaces, archaeal communities persist within conditions once believed impossible for biology altogether. Their ancestors inhabited hostile environments long before human beings existed, long before the continents occupied their present positions, long before mammals crossed the surface of the planet beneath this same sky. The boundary between life and lifelessness narrows here until it becomes difficult to define clearly. The tectonic plates beneath the rift continue separating even now. Not enough for the body to perceive, not enough for the eye to witness, but enough that over immense spans of time entire landscapes change shape. Millimeter by millimeter, the basin continues its descent. The process that built this lake did not finish when human civilization began recording history. It did not finish when the first caravan crossed the valley floor or when the first fortress rose above the shoreline. The geological mechanism remains active beneath every salt formation, every cliff, every ancient cave overlooking the water. Inside those caves, the dry mineral atmosphere still preserves fragile things against ordinary decay. Scrolls survive there for 2,000 years because the same environmental conditions, destroying life below, also prevented the breakdown of what had already died. The manuscripts remained untouched through empires, migrations, wars, and centuries of silence because this basin keeps what enters it: water, minerals, memory, meaning. Nothing fully leaves. Across the long procession of human history, the people arriving here changed continuously. Canaanites stood beside the shoreline before the Hebrew scriptures were written. Nabatean traders carried asphalt through desert trade routes under Roman skies. Byzantine pilgrims descended toward the water carrying sacred stories. Ottoman travelers crossed the valley with different languages and different maps. Modern visitors arrive through highways and electric lights. Yet beneath every cultural difference, the experience remained strangely constant. They encountered water that behaved unlike any other water on Earth. They encountered silence, missing the ordinary signatures of life. They encountered a place where geology itself seemed exposed. And so each civilization searched its own language for the most honest word available. The word endured because reality continued, confirming it generation after generation, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but physically. The lake remained what it was, regardless of who observed it. Empires disappeared. Religions spread outward across continents. Scientific revolutions transformed humanity's understanding of the universe. Still, the basin continued gathering minerals beneath the desert sky exactly as before. The word they chose was dead. It was accurate when the first voices spoke it beside these shores thousands of years ago. It remains accurate tonight. The water has not changed. Rest,